Clouds gathering over Eagle Pass that February afternoon told him everything he needed to know, and none of it was good. They were the color of old bruises, purple and black, and swollen with snow that hadn't started falling yet but would, soon enough, and when it did, it would come down hard and fast and mean. He'd seen storms like this before, up in the Rockies where the weather could turn on you in minutes, where a clear road could become a death trap before you'd even realized what was happening. But Abner had a schedule to keep, and the load in his trailer, medical supplies bound for a hospital in Glenwood Springs, couldn't wait for better weather. People's lives depended on what he was hauling, and that meant he was going through Eagle Pass whether the storm wanted him to or not. The radio crackled with weather warnings as he guided his Peterbilt up the winding mountain road, the engine growling low and steady as it worked against the grade. The highway was empty, which wasn't unusual for this time of year, this time of day, but something about the emptiness felt wrong to Abner. It was too quiet, too still, like the mountain itself was holding its breath and waiting for something terrible to happen. He'd passed the last gas station 20 miles back, a dingy little place that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in months, and now there was nothing but asphalt and pine trees in the gathering storm. The first snowflakes started hitting his windshield around 3 in the afternoon, fat and lazy, drifting down from that bruised sky like they had all the time in the world. Abner turned on his wipers and kept driving. Within an hour, those lazy flakes had turned into a wall of white that reduced visibility to maybe 20 feet if he was lucky. The wind had picked up too, howling across the pass and buffeting the trailer hard enough that Abner had to fight the wheel to keep the rig straight. His headlights carved weak tunnels through the snow, illuminating nothing but more snow, endless and disorienting. The road had disappeared beneath a blanket of white that was already 6 inches deep and getting deeper by the minute. Abner had been through bad weather before. You didn't drive trucks in Colorado for over 2 decades without learning how to handle snow. But this was different. This was the kind of storm that killed people, that buried vehicles, and didn't give them back until spring. He should have pulled over, should have found somewhere to wait it out, but there was nowhere to pull over to. The shoulder had vanished under the snow, and even if he could find it, stopping now meant getting stuck. And getting stuck up here in this storm meant freezing to death in his cab, while the wind screamed outside and the snow piled higher and higher. So he kept driving, kept pushing forward through the whiteout, his hands locked on the wheel and his eyes straining to see anything, any landmark or sign that would tell him where he was or how far he had left to go. The radio had gone to static, just a hiss of white noise that matched the storm outside, and Abner had given up trying to find a clear station. He was alone up here, completely alone, and that thought settled into his gut like a stone. The heater in the cab was running full blast, but he could still feel the cold seeping in through the windows, could see his breath misting in the air despite the hot air blowing from the vents. The temperature outside had to be well below 0, and with the wind chill it was probably closer to -30. Nobody could survive long in weather like this. Nobody should even be out in it. That's when his engine started to sputter. The sound was soft at first, barely noticeable over the wind and the rattle of the cab, but Abner had been driving long enough to know what it meant. He felt his stomach drop as the Peterbilt lurched, the engine missing a beat, then another, then catching again, but running rough. He pressed the accelerator and got nothing, the truck slowing despite his best efforts, the engine coughing and choking like it was drowning. Abner swore under his breath and started looking for anywhere to pull off, but the storm had swallowed everything. He couldn't see the road anymore, couldn't see anything but white, and the truck was dying beneath him whether he liked it or not. The engine gave one last shudder and quit entirely. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the wind hammering against the cab and the tick-tick-tick of the cooling engine. Abner sat there for a moment, his hands still on the wheel, trying to process what had just happened. He turned the key and got nothing, not even the click of the starter trying to engage. The electrical system was dead, the dashboard dark, the heater silent. He tried again, pumping the accelerator like that might help, but the truck was done. Whatever had killed it, water in the fuel line maybe or ice in the fuel filter, it wasn't coming back to life anytime soon, and certainly not here, not in the middle of a blizzard with no tools and no shelter. Abner pulled his coat tighter and looked out the window at the storm. He couldn't stay in the cab. Without the engine running, without the heater, he'd freeze to death in a few hours, maybe less. He needed to find shelter, needed to find help, needed to do something other than sit here and wait to die. He remembered passing a sign a few miles back, something about a service station ahead, but he couldn't remember how far ahead it was supposed to be. A mile? 5 miles? In this storm, a mile might as well have been 100. But it was the only option he had, so he decided to walk. He bundled himself up as best he could, thermal underwear under his jeans, 2 shirts under his insulated jacket, a wool hat pulled down over his ears, gloves that were already starting to feel inadequate against the cold. He grabbed a flashlight from the glove box, checked that it was working, and then stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and nearly knocking him off his feet. The cold was immediate and vicious, cutting through his layers like they weren't even there, finding every gap and seam and exploiting it mercilessly. Snow stung his face and clung to his beard, and within seconds he couldn't feel his cheeks or his nose. He turned his back to the wind and started walking, following what he hoped was the road, his flashlight beam swallowed by the blizzard almost as soon as it left the lens. Time stopped meaning anything. Abner walked and walked, 1 foot in front of the other, his body already starting to go numb from the cold. He couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of him, couldn't tell if he was still on the road or if he'd wandered off into the wilderness. His legs felt like lead, his lungs burned from breathing the frigid air, and every part of him screamed to lie down and rest, just for a minute, just long enough to catch his breath. But he knew that if he stopped moving, if he gave in to that exhaustion, he wouldn't get back up. The storm would bury him, and that would be the end of it. So he kept walking, kept pushing forward, even though he had no idea if he was walking toward safety or deeper into danger. And then through the curtain of snow, he saw lights. They were faint and wavering, barely visible through the storm, but they were there. Yellow rectangles that could only be windows, a building, shelter. Abner felt a surge of hope that was almost painful in its intensity, and he stumbled toward the lights, his numb legs barely obeying him anymore. The building materialized out of the blizzard like something from a dream, a low, concrete structure with a flat roof and a flickering neon sign that read "Service Station" in red letters. Half the letters were dark, making it read "SE Ice Stay On," and the whole place had a derelict, abandoned look to it that made Abner hesitate for just a moment. But the alternative was freezing to death in the storm, so he pushed open the glass door and stumbled inside, bringing half the blizzard in with him. The interior was dimly lit by a few fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow-green glow. The place looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. The floor was covered in a layer of grime and tracked-in dirt. The walls were water-stained and peeling, and the shelves that lined the room were mostly empty except for a few dusty cans of motor oil and some packages of food that looked like they'd been there since the 70s. There was a counter near the back with an old-fashioned cash register sitting on it, and behind the counter was a doorway that led to what Abner assumed was a garage or workshop. The whole place smelled like stale cigarette smoke and mildew and something else, something sweet and rotten that made his stomach turn, but it was warm, or at least warmer than outside. The storm was a muffled roar beyond the walls, and Abner could feel sensation starting to return to his fingers and toes, painful pinpricks that made him wince. He called out a greeting, his voice hoarse and rough, but got no response. The place seemed deserted, which struck him as odd. If the lights were on, someone had to be here, right? Someone had to be maintaining the place, keeping the heat running. He called out again, louder this time, and waited. Still nothing. Abner moved deeper into the station, his boots leaving wet prints on the dirty floor. He checked the aisles, looking for anyone who might be around, but found nothing. The doorway behind the counter beckoned to him, and after a moment's hesitation he walked around the counter and peered through it. The garage beyond was even darker than the main room, lit only by a single work light that hung from the ceiling and swayed slightly in a draft he couldn't feel. There was a car up on a lift, an old sedan that looked like it had been there for decades, its tires rotted away and its body covered in rust. Tools were scattered on a workbench nearby, and there was a rolling tool chest against one wall, its drawers hanging open. That's when Abner saw the blood. It was on the floor near the workbench, a dark stain that had soaked into the concrete and spread out in a rough circle about 3 feet across. The stain was old, dried to a rust-brown color, but there was no mistaking what it was. Abner felt his pulse quicken as he stared at it, his mind trying to come up with innocent explanations and failing. That was too much blood to have come from a minor injury. Someone had been badly hurt here, or worse. He should leave. He should turn around and walk back out into the storm and take his chances with the cold, because whatever had happened in this garage, he didn't want any part of it. But the storm was still raging outside, and leaving meant dying. So, instead of running, Abner started looking around more carefully, trying to figure out what had happened here and whether whoever had caused that bloodstain was still around. The workbench held an assortment of tools, all of them old and grimy, and there were rags piled in one corner that were stiff with what looked like more dried blood. A clipboard hung on the wall nearby, and Abner pulled it down to examine it. The top page was a work order, dated from 3 years ago, for a brake job on a Ford pickup. The customer name was written in a cramped, almost illegible hand, J. Morrison. The order had never been completed. Below it were more work orders, all of them old, all of them incomplete, like the garage had just stopped operating one day in the middle of serving customers. Abner hung the clipboard back up and moved to the tool chest, pulling open drawers at random. Most of them contained what you'd expect: wrenches, screwdrivers, sockets, but one drawer near the bottom held something that made his blood run cold. It was full of identification cards, driver's licenses, credit cards, insurance cards, all of them jumbled together like someone had just dumped them in there without any thought to organization. Abner picked one up, a Colorado driver's license belonging to a woman named Sarah Chen, and stared at the photo. She was young, maybe 30, with a bright smile and dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. The license had expired 2 years ago. He dropped it back into the drawer and picked up another one, this time a credit card belonging to someone named Michael Dorsey, then another and another, each one belonging to a different person, each one adding to the growing sense of horror that was building in Abner's chest. These weren't just random cards that had been found or stolen. This was a collection. Someone had taken these cards from people, had kept them as trophies or reminders, and that someone had to be connected to this place. Abner's hands were shaking as he pushed the drawer shut, his mind racing. He needed to get out of here, needed to call the police, needed to do something other than stand here in this garage surrounded by evidence of God knew what crimes. But his phone had no signal. He'd checked it when he first came inside, and the storm outside was still too dangerous to risk. He was trapped here, in this place where terrible things had clearly happened, and all he could do was hope that whoever was responsible wasn't coming back. A sound from the main room made him freeze. It was soft, barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant roar of the storm, but it was there. Footsteps. Someone was walking across the floor of the station, their shoes scuffing against the grime-covered tiles. Abner's heart hammered in his chest as he looked around the garage for somewhere to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The room was too open, too exposed. If someone came through that doorway, they'd see him immediately. He grabbed a wrench from the workbench, hefting it in his hand, and backed up against the wall beside the doorway, where he'd be out of sight for at least a few seconds when they entered. The footsteps came closer, slow and deliberate, and Abner held his breath. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold that still clung to him from his walk through the storm. The footsteps stopped just outside the doorway, and for a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then a voice called out, rough and suspicious and unmistakably male. "I know you're in there," the voice said. "Come on out where I can see you." Abner didn't move. He kept his grip on the wrench and waited, every muscle in his body tensed. The voice came again, closer now, like the speaker was standing right on the other side of the wall. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the voice said. "You're trespassing on private property, and I got every right to defend it. So either you come out now, or I come in there and drag you out." Abner swallowed hard and made a decision. He couldn't hide forever, and whoever this person was, they already knew he was here. Maybe they were just a caretaker, someone who looked after the place and was understandably upset about finding a stranger in their garage. Maybe there was an innocent explanation for the blood and the IDs. Maybe. But Abner didn't believe that. Not really. And his grip on the wrench didn't loosen as he stepped around the doorway and into the main room. The man standing there was short and wiry, maybe 5'6", with a gaunt face and hollow eyes that looked too large for his skull. He was wearing grease-stained coveralls and work boots, and his hands were empty, held up at chest level in what might have been a gesture of peace if his expression hadn't been so hostile. His hair was thin and gray, slicked back from his forehead, and there was a nervous energy about him that made Abner think of a rat cornered in a cage. The man's eyes flicked to the wrench in Abner's hand and then back up to his face, and a thin smile stretched across his lips. "You won't need that," the man said. His voice was higher than Abner had expected, almost whining. "Name's Silas Creedy. I run this place. Or used to, anyway, before the state stopped sending people up this road. You got car trouble?" Abner lowered the wrench slightly but didn't put it down. "Truck trouble," he said. "Engine died about 2 miles back. I walked here through the storm." Silas nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Abner's face. "That's a hell of a walk in this weather," he said. "You're lucky you didn't freeze. Come on inside. Warm yourself up proper. I got coffee on, and we can talk about getting your truck fixed once the storm blows over." Everything in Abner's gut told him not to trust this man, but he didn't see that he had much choice. He was still cold, still exhausted from his walk through the blizzard, and he needed shelter until the storm passed. So he nodded and followed Silas back toward the counter, keeping a careful distance between them. Silas moved behind the counter and disappeared through a door Abner hadn't noticed before, one that led to what looked like a small office or back room. Abner stood in the main room and waited, his eyes scanning the space for anything that might tell him more about this place or the man who ran it. That's when he noticed the photographs on the wall behind the counter. They were old, faded with age, and showed various people standing in front of the service station. Customers, probably, or employees. But as Abner looked closer, he realized that many of the faces in those photographs matched the faces on the IDs he'd found in the garage. Sarah Chen was there, standing beside a Ford sedan with a smile on her face. Michael Dorsey was in another photo, his arm around a woman who wasn't in any of the pictures. There were others too, dozens of them, all smiling and happy and completely unaware that they were posing for what might have been the last photographs ever taken of them. Abner felt his blood turn to ice. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't innocent. Silas Creedy had done something to these people, had taken their IDs and kept their pictures, and now Abner was trapped here with him, while the storm raged outside and nobody in the world knew where he was. He looked toward the door that Silas had disappeared through and made a decision. He wasn't going to wait around to find out what Silas had planned for him. He was going to leave, storm or no storm, and he was going to do it right now. He turned toward the front door and had taken exactly 3 steps when Silas emerged from the back room holding 2 mugs of coffee. The man's expression shifted when he saw Abner moving toward the exit, the false friendliness dropping away to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. "Where you going?" Silas asked, his voice sharp. "I thought you wanted to get warm." "Changed my mind," Abner said, not stopping. "I'll take my chances with the storm." He reached for the door handle, but before his fingers could close around it, something hard and heavy slammed into the back of his head. Pain exploded through his skull, and his vision went white, then dark around the edges. He felt himself falling, felt his knees hit the floor, and then he felt nothing at all. Abner woke to the smell of rust and motor oil and something else, something organic and rotten that made his stomach heave. His head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that pulsed in time with his heartbeat, and when he tried to move his hands, he found they were bound behind his back with something that felt like zip ties cutting into his wrists. His ankles were similarly restrained, and he was lying on his side on a cold concrete floor that pressed against his cheek. He kept his eyes closed for a moment, listening, trying to get his bearings before whoever had hit him realized he was awake. The storm was still audible, but distant now, muffled by walls and maybe distance, and he could hear other sounds closer by, the drip of water somewhere, the creak of metal settling, and breathing that wasn't his own. He risked opening his eyes just a crack, and found himself staring at a pair of work boots, maybe 6 feet away. The boots were old and scuffed, splattered with stains that were too dark to be mud, and above them were the grease-stained coveralls he'd seen before. Silas Creedy was sitting on a metal folding chair with his back to Abner, hunched over something Abner couldn't see, his movements quick and furtive like he was working on a project he didn't want interrupted. Abner could hear him muttering to himself, a low, continuous stream of words that were too quiet to make out clearly, but sounded like he was having an argument with someone who wasn't there. The space they were in was the garage Abner had explored earlier, he realized. The same room with the bloodstain and the car up on the lift. But now he was seeing it from floor level, and the bloodstain was much closer than he would have liked. The work light overhead swayed slightly in a draft, making shadows dance across the walls, and Abner used the movement to cover his own as he tested his restraints. The zip ties were tight, professional, the kind that wouldn't break no matter how hard he pulled. His fingers were already going numb from the restricted circulation, and his shoulders ached from having his arms wrenched behind his back. He couldn't see anything he could use to cut the ties, no sharp edges within reach, nothing but smooth concrete and that bloodstain spreading out beneath him like a prophecy. His phone was gone from his pocket. He could feel the empty space where it should have been, and his keys and wallet were gone too. Silas had stripped him of anything useful while he was unconscious, which meant this wasn't the man's first time doing this. He'd done it before, probably many times before, and he'd gotten good at it. Silas stood up abruptly and turned around, and Abner quickly closed his eyes again, trying to keep his breathing steady and deep, like he was still unconscious. He heard the footsteps approach, felt the presence of the other man looming over him, and then there was a sharp kick to his ribs that drove the air from his lungs and sent a bolt of pain through his chest. Abner gasped and curled in on himself instinctively, and Silas laughed, a high-pitched sound that had no warmth in it at all. "I know you're awake," Silas said, his voice coming from somewhere above Abner's head. "Been watching you for the last 5 minutes, seeing your eyes move under the lids. You're not as good at playing possum as you think you are, trucker man. Now, you gonna open your eyes and have a conversation with me, or do I need to kick you again to get your attention?" Abner opened his eyes and looked up at Silas, who was standing over him with his hands on his hips and an expression on his face that was equal parts amusement and contempt. Up close like this, Abner could see details he'd missed before. The yellowed teeth when Silas smiled, the broken capillaries in his nose and cheeks that spoke of too much drinking, the way his hands trembled slightly even when he was standing still. This was a man who was barely holding himself together, a man who was one bad day away from coming completely apart, and that made him more dangerous than someone who was calm and controlled. Unpredictable men did unpredictable things, and Abner had no idea what Silas was planning to do with him. "What do you want?" Abner asked, his voice rough and dry. His mouth tasted like blood where he'd bitten his tongue when he hit the floor, and speaking made his head throb worse. "You want money? My truck? Whatever it is, you can have it. Just let me go." Silas shook his head slowly, still smiling that unpleasant smile. "Can't do that," he said. "You seen too much, poked your nose into things that weren't any of your business. That drawer in the tool chest, all them IDs and cards. You found those, didn't you? I could tell by the look on your face when I came back with the coffee. You were fixing to run, fixing to go to the police and tell them all about poor old Silas Creedy and his little collection. Can't have that. Can't have you ruining everything I built here." "I don't know what you're talking about," Abner said, trying to buy time, trying to think of any way out of this situation. "I didn't see anything. I was just looking for tools to fix my truck, that's all." "Don't lie to me," Silas said, and the smile dropped away completely, replaced by something cold and dead. "I hate liars worse than anything. You saw the IDs, you saw the pictures on the wall, and you put it together same as anyone would. You figured out what happened to all those people who stopped here over the years, all those folks who had car trouble or needed gas or just wanted to get out of the weather for a minute. You figured out that they never made it back to their cars, never made it home to their families, never made it anywhere except into a hole in the ground out back where nobody's ever going to find them." The casual way he said it, like he was discussing the weather or the score of a football game, made Abner's blood run cold. This man was insane, completely disconnected from normal human emotion or empathy, and he was admitting to multiple murders like it was nothing worth getting worked up about. Abner's mind raced, trying to calculate how many people were represented by the IDs in that drawer, how many bodies were buried somewhere on this property, how long Silas had been doing this. Years, probably, maybe decades, and the police had never caught him because Eagle Pass was remote, and the storms were frequent and people went missing in the mountains all the time. It was the perfect hunting ground for someone like Silas, and he'd been taking advantage of it for God knew how long. "You're not going to get away with this," Abner said, knowing, even as he said it, that it was a stupid thing to say, the kind of thing people said in movies when they were trying to convince themselves they had some control over the situation. "People know where I am. My company tracks all the trucks with GPS. When I don't check in, they'll send someone looking for me." Silas laughed again, that same high, unpleasant sound. "Your truck's 2 miles from here buried under 3 feet of snow by now," he said, "and this storm's just getting started. Weather Service says it's going to dump another 2 feet before morning, maybe more. By the time anyone comes looking for you, if they even bother, which I doubt, there won't be nothing to find. You'll be just another trucker who went missing in a blizzard. Happens all the time up here. Folks will shake their heads and say what a shame it was, and then they'll forget all about you and move on with their lives. He crouched down beside Abner, bringing his face close enough that Abner could smell the coffee on his breath and see the madness swimming in his eyes. "You want to know the funny thing?" Silas said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I wasn't always like this. Used to be a regular mechanic, ran this station legit for years, had a wife, had a life, had everything a man could want. But then the highway department rerouted the interstate, moved all the traffic 10 miles west, and nobody came through here anymore. Business dried up, wife left me, and I was sitting here in this garage day after day with nothing to do and nobody to talk to. That's when the first one showed up." He paused, his eyes going distant like he was remembering something from a long time ago. "She was a college girl, car broke down right out front. Pretty thing. Reminded me of my daughter before she stopped calling. I helped her with the car, got it running again, and she thanked me and drove off. But I kept thinking about her, kept wondering what would have happened if I'd done something different, if I'd been a different kind of person, and then the next one came along, and I decided to find out." Abner felt sick listening to this, sick and terrified and furious all at once. This man was talking about murder like it was some kind of personal journey, some kind of experiment in human nature, and he clearly felt no remorse for any of it. The worst part was that he seemed to want Abner to understand, to see things from his perspective, like they were two reasonable men having a philosophical discussion instead of a killer and his bound victim lying on a blood-soaked floor. "You're insane," Abner said, putting as much contempt into his voice as he could manage. "You're a sick, twisted bastard, and I hope you rot in hell for what you've done." Silas's expression hardened, and he stood up abruptly, his hands clenching into fists. "Insane?" he said, his voice rising. "Insane is sitting in this station for 10 years, waiting for customers who never come, watching everything you built fall apart around you while the world moves on and forgets you ever existed. Insane is working yourself to the bone your whole life and having nothing to show for it but an empty building and a mailbox full of bills you can't pay. I did what I had to do to survive, to give my life some kind of meaning, and I'm not going to apologize for it to you or anyone else." He walked over to the workbench and picked something up, and when he turned back around, Abner saw he was holding a long-handled wrench, the kind used for loosening lug nuts on heavy trucks. The metal was old and pitted with rust, and there were dark stains on the handle that Abner knew weren't rust at all. Silas hefted the wrench, testing its weight, and then started walking back toward Abner with slow, deliberate steps that echoed in the empty garage. This was it, Abner realized. This was how he was going to die, beaten to death with a wrench in a forgotten service station while a blizzard raged outside and buried any evidence of his existence. He thought about his wife back home, about his grown daughter who lived in Oregon, about all the things he'd never get to say to them or do with them. He thought about the medical supplies in his trailer that would never make it to the hospital, about the people who would suffer because he hadn't completed his delivery. And then he stopped thinking about anything except surviving the next few minutes. When Silas raised the wrench, Abner did the only thing he could do. He rolled. The wrench came down hard on the concrete where his head had been a second earlier, striking sparks and making a sound like a gunshot in the enclosed space. Abner kept rolling, his bound hands and feet making it awkward and graceless, but he managed to get some distance between himself and Silas. He fetched up against the base of the car lift and used it to push himself into a sitting position, his back against the metal frame, his eyes on Silas, who was already coming at him again with the wrench raised high. "Hold still, damn you!" Silas shouted, bringing the wrench down again. Abner twisted to the side and the wrench clanged off the lift's frame inches from his shoulder. The vibration traveled up the metal and into Abner's back, rattling his teeth, but at least the wrench hadn't connected with his skull. Silas was breathing hard now, his face flushed with exertion and rage, and he raised the wrench for another strike. But this time Abner was ready. As the wrench descended, he kicked out with both feet, catching Silas in the shin. It wasn't a hard kick. He didn't have the leverage or the strength for that with his ankles bound, but it was enough to throw off Silas's aim. The wrench glanced off Abner's shoulder instead of his head, sending a jolt of pain down his arm, but nothing worse. Silas stumbled backward, cursing, and Abner used the momentary reprieve to look around desperately for anything he could use to defend himself or cut his restraints. The garage was full of tools and equipment, but all of it was too far away to reach, and even if he could reach it, he wasn't sure what good it would do him with his hands tied behind his back. His eyes landed on the bloodstain again, that dark circle on the concrete that marked where someone else had died, and something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to die here. He wasn't going to become another trophy in Silas's collection, another face on the wall, another set of IDs in a drawer. He was going to fight, going to survive, and if that meant he had to get creative, then that's what he'd do. Silas had recovered and was advancing again, more cautious this time, keeping the wrench at the ready but not rushing in blindly like before. "You're just making this harder on yourself," he said, his voice strained. "I was going to make it quick, one hit and you wouldn't feel nothing. But now I'm thinking maybe I'll take my time, make you suffer for all the trouble you're causing me. How's that sound, trucker man? Want to find out how long a man can stay conscious while I work on him with this wrench?" Abner didn't answer. He was too busy watching Silas's feet, waiting for the right moment. When Silas took another step forward, Abner pushed off from the lift with his back and threw himself forward, head first, aiming for Silas's knees. It was a desperate move, stupid and reckless, but it was all he had. His shoulder connected with Silas's legs, and he felt the smaller man start to topple. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, Abner's weight driving Silas backward, and the wrench went clattering across the concrete floor out of reach. For a moment they just lay there, both of them trying to catch their breath. And then Silas started hitting Abner with his fists, wild punches that caught him in the ribs and the back and the side of his head. Abner couldn't defend himself with his hands tied, couldn't do anything but try to roll away and protect his head as best he could. One of Silas's punches caught him in the temple, and his vision exploded into stars, and he knew if he didn't do something right now he was going to lose this fight. He twisted his body, trying to get his weight on top of Silas, and managed to get his knee into the smaller man's stomach. Silas grunted, and his punches faltered, and Abner pressed his advantage. He rocked forward, using his shoulder to pin Silas's chest, and then brought his head down as hard as he could. The headbutt caught Silas square in the nose, and there was a crunch of breaking cartilage. Silas screamed, a high keening sound, and blood poured from his nostrils down his face and into his mouth. He bucked and thrashed, trying to throw Abner off, but Abner held on grimly. He could feel his own strength starting to fail, could feel the exhaustion and pain catching up with him, but he couldn't let go. If he let go, Silas would get to the wrench or find another weapon, and then it would be over. So he held on, using his weight to keep Silas pinned, and tried to figure out what to do next. That's when he heard another voice, high and female and coming from somewhere near the doorway to the main room. "Silas, what the hell is going on back here?" Both men froze. Abner twisted his head to look toward the doorway and saw a woman standing there, middle-aged and heavy-set, wearing a waitress uniform with a name tag that read Marjorie. She had a coffee pot in one hand and a look of shock on her face as she took in the scene. Two men on the floor, one of them bleeding from a broken nose, the other with his hands tied behind his back, and a wrench lying abandoned on the concrete. Her eyes went wide, and the coffee pot slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor and sending hot liquid splashing across the concrete. "Marjorie," Silas gasped, blood bubbling from his broken nose. "Help me. This man attacked me. Tried to rob the station. Help me get him under control." Marjorie didn't move. She just stood there staring, her face gone pale, and Abner could see her mind working, putting together the pieces same as he had earlier. She saw the blood stain on the floor, saw the way Silas was lying with his hands covered in blood that wasn't all from his nose, saw the photographs on the wall visible through the doorway behind her. And she understood. Abner could see the moment when understanding clicked into place, could see the horror and disgust wash over her features. "My God," she whispered. "Silas, what have you done?" "Don't listen to him," Abner said quickly, his voice urgent. "He's been killing people, Marjorie. He's been killing people who stop here and burying them out back. He was going to kill me, too. You have to call the police. You have to—" "Shut up!" Silas screamed, and he managed to get one hand free and grabbed Abner by the throat. His fingers dug into Abner's windpipe, cutting off his air, and Abner gagged and tried to pull away but couldn't with his hands still bound. Silas's face was inches from his own, twisted with rage and fear, and Abner could see the madness there plain as day. "Marjorie, don't listen to him. He's lying, trying to turn you against me. You know me. You've known me for 20 years. Would I do something like that?" Marjorie was backing toward the door, her hands up like she was trying to ward off something evil. "I don't know," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know what you'd do, Silas. I thought I knew you, but looking at this—" She gestured vaguely at the garage, at the bloodstain, at the two men on the floor. "I don't know anything anymore." Silas's grip on Abner's throat tightened, and black spots started appearing in Abner's vision. He could feel himself starting to lose consciousness, could feel his body going limp, and he knew he had maybe seconds left before it was too late. He did the only thing he could think of and brought his knee up hard between Silas's legs. The effect was immediate. Silas's grip loosened, and he fell away with a strangled cry, curling into a ball on the concrete. Abner rolled away gasping and coughing, trying to get air back into his lungs, and looked up at Marjorie, who was still standing in the doorway frozen. "Please," Abner wheezed, "call the police. There's a phone in the office. I saw it when I came in. Just call them and tell them what's happening here. Please." Marjorie looked at him, then at Silas, who was still curled up and groaning, then back at Abner. For a long moment she didn't move, and Abner thought she was going to turn and run, going to leave him here with Silas and the storm and whatever fate was waiting. But then she nodded, just once, and turned and disappeared through the doorway. Abner heard her footsteps running across the main room, heard a door open and close, and then there was silence except for Silas's labored breathing and the distant howl of the wind outside. Abner lay on the cold concrete trying to get his breathing under control while keeping one eye on Silas, who was still curled up on the floor, clutching himself and making low, wounded sounds. Every part of Abner's body hurt, his head from where he'd been hit, his throat from being choked, his shoulders from having his arms wrenched behind his back for so long, his ribs from the kick and the punches. But he was alive, still conscious, still capable of thinking and acting, and that meant he had a chance. He needed to get these zip ties off his wrists before Silas recovered enough to come at him again. Needed to find something sharp or something he could use to cut through the plastic. His eyes scanned the garage floor looking for anything useful and landed on a piece of broken glass from the coffee pot Marjorie had dropped. It was maybe 3 inches long and wickedly sharp, glinting in the light from the overhead bulb. The glass was 10 feet away, too far to reach easily with his hands tied, but Abner had no other options. He started inching his way across the floor on his side, using his shoulders and his bound legs to propel himself forward like some kind of injured caterpillar. Every movement sent jolts of pain through his battered body, but he ignored it, focusing only on getting to that piece of glass. Behind him, he could hear Silas starting to move, could hear the man's breathing becoming steadier and more controlled, and he knew his window of opportunity was closing fast. He pushed himself harder, dragging his body across the concrete, leaving smears of blood from where his cheek had been split open during the fight. The glass was 5 feet away now, then 3, then close enough to touch if he could just stretch a little further. His fingers closed around the glass shard, and immediately he felt it cut into his palm, the edge razor-sharp and unforgiving. He didn't care about the pain, didn't care about the blood running down his wrist and soaking into the sleeve of his jacket. He twisted his hands as much as the zip ties would allow and started sawing at the plastic with the glass, working blind, having to go by feel alone. The plastic was thick and industrial grade, and it resisted his efforts. But Abner kept sawing, kept working at it, his movements becoming more frantic as he heard Silas getting to his feet behind him. The zip tie started to fray, individual strands of plastic separating under the constant pressure of the glass, and Abner redoubled his efforts even though his hand was slick with blood and the glass kept trying to slip from his grip. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Silas's voice came from somewhere behind him, thick and nasal from his broken nose. "Think you can get loose and overpower me? Maybe make it out of here alive? But you're not going nowhere, trucker man. This garage is where you die, same as all the others. Same as every damn fool who ever thought they could get away from me." Abner didn't waste breath responding. He kept sawing at the zip tie, feeling it give way strand by strand, feeling the pressure on his wrists starting to loosen. He could hear Silas moving closer, could hear the man's boots scraping across the concrete, and he knew he had maybe seconds before Silas was on him again. The last strand of plastic separated, and suddenly his hands were free. The sensation of blood rushing back into his fingers almost painful in its intensity. He rolled onto his back and brought his hands around in front of him just as Silas came into view, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Silas had found the wrench. He was holding it in both hands like a baseball bat, his face a mask of blood and fury, and he was bringing it down in a vicious arc aimed directly at Abner's skull. Abner threw his hands up instinctively and the wrench connected with his forearms instead of his head, and he felt something crack in his left wrist. The pain was immediate and intense, shooting up his arm like electricity, but it was better than having his skull caved in. Silas raised the wrench for another strike and Abner kicked out with his bound legs, catching Silas in the knee. The man stumbled but didn't go down, and the wrench came down again, this time glancing off Abner's shoulder and striking the concrete beside his head hard enough to send chips of stone flying. Abner grabbed the wrench with his good hand before Silas could raise it again, his fingers closing around the cold metal, and suddenly they were locked in a struggle for control of the weapon. Silas was smaller than Abner, but he had leverage and position on his side, and he was fighting with the desperate strength of a man who knew this was his last chance. Abner's injured wrist was useless, hanging limp at his side, and his legs were still bound, which meant he couldn't get the footing he needed to really contest the wrench. He could feel his grip starting to slip, could feel Silas starting to wrench the tool away from him, and he knew if he lost control of it he was dead. So he did the only thing he could think of and pulled instead of pushed, yanking the wrench toward himself as hard as he could. The sudden change in direction caught Silas off guard, and he stumbled forward, falling on top of Abner, and the two men went down in a heap with the wrench trapped between them. Abner felt the metal pressing into his chest, felt Silas's weight on top of him driving the air from his lungs, and he struggled to get out from under the smaller man. They rolled across the floor, grappling and clawing at each other, both of them trying to gain the upper hand. Abner managed to get his good hand around Silas's throat and squeezed. feeling the windpipe compress under his fingers. But Silas brought his knee up into Abner's stomach and the trucker had to let go as he gasped for air. They broke apart and scrambled away from each other, both of them breathing hard, both of them bleeding from various cuts and scrapes, and the wrench lay on the floor between them like a prize waiting to be claimed. For a moment they just stared at each other, taking stock, and then both men lunged for the wrench at the same time. Abner got there first, his fingers closing around the handle, but Silas was right behind him and he grabbed Abner's injured wrist and twisted. The pain was blinding, all-consuming, and Abner screamed and lost his grip on the wrench. Silas snatched it up and scrambled backward, putting distance between them, and when he stood up he was smiling again despite the blood covering the lower half of his face and the wild, desperate look in his eyes. He hefted the wrench and started toward Abner, who was still on the floor, cradling his broken wrist against his chest. "End of the line," Silas said, his voice thick with blood and satisfaction. "I gotta admit, you put up more of a fight than most. Usually they just cry and beg, promise me anything if I'll let them go. But not you. You're a fighter, I respect that. Doesn't change nothing, but I respect it." He raised the wrench high, preparing to deliver the killing blow, and Abner closed his eyes. This was it. After everything he'd survived, the blizzard, the fight, the choking, this was how it ended. He thought of his wife one more time, pictured her face, and hoped she would forgive him for not being more careful, for not seeing the danger before it was too late. He waited for the impact, for the pain, and then the darkness, but it never came. Instead, he heard a sound like a melon being struck with a hammer, a wet thud that was somehow both soft and violent at the same time. He opened his eyes and saw Silas standing over him with a strange expression on his face, confused and surprised. And then the man toppled forward like a tree being felled. Silas hit the floor face first and didn't move. Behind him stood Marjorie, holding what looked like a length of iron pipe in both hands, her face pale and shocked and splattered with blood that wasn't her own. She was shaking so hard Abner could see it from where he lay, and the pipe dropped from her hands and rang against the concrete like a bell. She stared down at Silas's unmoving form and then up at Abner, and her mouth worked, but no sound came out at first. When she finally managed to speak, her voice was barely a whisper. "Is he dead?" she asked. "Oh God, is he dead? I didn't mean to. I just saw him about to. I couldn't let him." "I don't know," Abner said, his own voice rough and strained. He pushed himself up to a sitting position with his good hand and looked at Silas. The man wasn't moving, wasn't breathing that Abner could see, and there was blood pooling under his head from where the pipe had connected. "Check his pulse. Press your fingers against his neck and see if you feel anything." Marjorie shook her head violently, backing away from Silas's body. "I can't," she said. "I can't touch him. What if he wakes up? What if he—" "He's not waking up," Abner said, more harshly than he intended. "And even if he is alive, he's not going to be hurting anyone for a while. Did you call the police? Are they coming?" Marjorie nodded, still staring at Silas. "I called from the office phone, told them there was a fight, someone was hurt, they needed to send help right away. But the dispatcher said with the storm it might be hours before they can get anyone up here. The roads are completely impassable, everything's shut down. We're on our own until the weather clears." Hours. Abner felt his heart sink. Hours meant sitting here in this garage with Silas's body or near body, waiting and hoping the man didn't wake up and come at them again, hoping he didn't bleed out from his injuries, hoping the police actually showed up before something else went wrong. He looked down at his bound ankles and then at Marjorie. "Can you untie my legs?" he asked. "There should be something in the toolbox we can use to cut the zip tie." Marjorie blinked and seemed to come back to herself. She nodded and moved to the workbench, rifling through drawers until she found a pair of wire cutters. She knelt beside Abner and carefully cut through the zip tie around his ankles. and he felt the circulation start to return to his feet in a painful rush of pins and needles. He tried to stand, and immediately his legs buckled, too numb and weak to support his weight, and he had to grab onto the car lift to keep from falling. Marjorie steadied him with one hand on his arm, and together they managed to get him upright and leaning against the lift's frame. "Thank you," Abner said, looking at her directly for the first time since she'd hit Silas. "You saved my life. If you hadn't come back when you did, if you hadn't—" "Don't," Marjorie said, cutting him off. She was crying now, tears running down her face and dripping off her chin. "Don't thank me. I should have known. All these years I've been coming here, bringing Silas coffee and sandwiches from the diner, talking to him about nothing important, and I never knew what he was doing. Never suspected. What kind of person does that make me?" "The kind who couldn't have known," Abner said firmly. "People like Silas, they're good at hiding what they are. They seem normal, seem safe, right up until the moment they're not. You couldn't have seen it. Nobody could have." But even as he said it, he wondered if that was true. Had there been signs? Had there been things Marjorie or others had noticed over the years and dismissed or explained away? The isolated location, the empty station, the way Silas always seemed to be here alone with no family and no friends. Maybe those weren't signs of anything sinister. Or maybe they were and everyone had just been too polite or too busy to look closer. Abner supposed it didn't matter now. What mattered was that Silas was stopped, that the killing was over, that the families of all those people in the photographs might finally get some answers about what happened to their loved ones. He looked around the garage, really seeing it for the first time now that he wasn't fighting for his life. There was so much evidence here, so many traces of Silas's crimes if you knew where to look. The blood stain on the floor was just the most obvious. There were others, smaller stains that had been scrubbed but not completely removed, dark spots on the walls and the underside of the workbench. There were tools with suspicious stains, rags that were stiff with old blood, a drain in the floor that probably led to a septic system or a pit where Silas had disposed of evidence. And then there was the drawer full of IDs, the photographs on the wall, the stories those items told about lives cut short and families left wondering. The police were going to have a field day with this place, and Abner hoped they were thorough enough to find everything, to piece together exactly how many people had died here and who they were. "We should get out of this garage," Marjorie said suddenly, her voice shaky but stronger than before. "Go wait in the main room where it's warmer. I don't want to be back here with him." Abner nodded. He didn't want to be here either, didn't want to spend another second in this place where so many people had died, but he needed to make sure Silas wasn't going to get up and come after them again. He hobbled over to where Silas lay and, using his good hand, pressed 2 fingers against the man's neck just below the jaw. He felt around for several seconds, searching for a pulse, and found one, weak and thready but definitely there. Silas was alive, unconscious but alive, and that meant they needed to be careful. Abner looked around for something they could use to restrain him and spotted a coil of rope hanging on the wall. He pointed to it and Marjorie retrieved it, her hands still shaking, and together they managed to bind Silas's hands and feet, making the knots as tight as they could manage. It wasn't perfect. Abner's injured wrist made it hard to work, and Marjorie had never tied anyone up before. But it would have to do. They left Silas lying on the garage floor and made their way into the main room of the station. The lights were still buzzing overhead, and the storm was still howling outside, visible through the windows as a solid wall of white that showed no signs of letting up. Marjorie went behind the counter and started making fresh coffee, probably more for something to do with her hands than because either of them wanted any, and Abner sank down into a plastic chair near the front windows. His entire body felt like one giant bruise, and his broken wrist was swelling up and starting to turn purple. He needed medical attention, needed to have the wrist set and splinted properly, needed to be checked for internal injuries and concussion. But all of that would have to wait until the police arrived and the storm passed and the roads were clear enough to get an ambulance up here. He looked at the photographs on the wall again, seeing them differently now that he knew what they represented. Each face was someone who had stopped at this station expecting nothing more than gas or repairs or shelter from the weather, and each one had met their end at Silas's hands. How many were there? Abner started counting the photographs and stopped when he reached 30. 30 people, minimum, over who knew how many years. It was staggering, incomprehensible, the kind of body count you associated with serial killers who made national news, not small-time mechanics running forgotten service stations in the Colorado mountains. But that was probably how Silas had gotten away with it for so long. Nobody was looking for a killer up here. Nobody suspected that the quiet mechanic who fixed their cars and made small talk about the weather was murdering people and burying them in the woods. Marjorie brought 2 cups of coffee over and handed one to Abner. He took it with his good hand and sipped it carefully, feeling the heat spread through his chest. It was terrible coffee, burnt and bitter, but it was hot, and it gave him something to focus on besides the pain and the fear and the knowledge of how close he'd come to dying. Marjorie sat down in the chair next to him and stared out at the storm, her own coffee untouched in her lap. "I've worked at the diner in town for 15 years, she said after a long silence. Known Silas almost the whole time. He used to come in once or twice a week for breakfast. Always ordered the same thing. Eggs over easy, bacon, wheat toast. He was quiet, polite, always left a decent tip. When business at the station started drying up, I felt bad for him. Started bringing him food sometimes when I knew he probably wasn't eating right. He seemed lonely, you know, like he could use a friend." She laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. "Guess I was wrong about that. Guess you can't ever really know a person, no matter how long you've known them or how well you think you understand them. Makes you wonder who else in town might be hiding something like this. Makes you wonder if you can trust anyone." "You can't think like that," Abner said, even though he understood the impulse. "Most people are exactly what they seem to be. Silas was an aberration, an exception. You can't let what he did poison your view of everyone else." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it himself. The truth was that Silas had seemed like a normal person right up until he'd hit Abner over the head and tied him up in the garage. There had been no obvious warning signs, no flashing neon indicators that said, "This man is dangerous, stay away." And if Silas could hide what he was so effectively, who was to say there weren't others like him out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right opportunity to reveal their true nature? It was a disturbing thought, one that Abner tried to push away but couldn't quite manage. They sat in silence for a while, drinking their terrible coffee and listening to the storm. Abner found his eyes drifting back to the photographs on the wall, studying the faces, wondering about their stories. Who had they been? Where had they been going when they stopped here? Did their families still wonder what happened to them, or had they given up hope years ago and moved on? He hoped the police would be able to identify all of them, hoped their families would at least get closure even if it came decades too late. It was small comfort, but it was something. The office phone rang suddenly, shrill and loud in the quiet of the station, and both Abner and Marjorie jumped. Marjorie set down her coffee and went to answer it, disappearing into the small office behind the counter. Abner could hear her talking but couldn't make out the words, and after a minute she came back out with an expression on her face that Abner couldn't quite read. "That was the police," she said. "They're sending officers as soon as they can, but the storm's even worse than they thought. Main highway is completely blocked by a jackknifed semi, and they can't get plows through until it's moved. They're saying it might be dawn before anyone can reach us. They want us to stay put, stay safe, and call them immediately if anything changes. Dawn. That was hours away still. Maybe 8 or 10 hours depending on when the storm finally broke and the plows could start working. 8 to 10 hours sitting in this station with an unconscious killer tied up in the garage and nothing to do but wait and hope he didn't wake up. Abner felt exhaustion pulling at him, his adrenaline finally starting to wear off and leaving nothing but pain and fatigue in its wake. His eyes felt heavy and his thoughts were starting to blur at the edges, but he knew he couldn't sleep. Someone needed to stay awake and keep watch, needed to make sure Silas stayed restrained and unconscious, needed to be ready to call for help if something went wrong. "You should try to rest," Marjorie said, as if reading his thoughts. "I'll keep watch. You've been through hell tonight. You need to conserve your strength." "So have you," Abner pointed out. "You're the one who had to hit him. You're the one who's going to have to live with that." "I'll live with it just fine," Marjorie said, and there was steel in her voice now. The same steel that had let her come back into the garage when she could have run, that had let her pick up a pipe and swing it at another human being's head. "He was going to kill you. Would have killed me too, eventually, once I knew what he'd done. I did what I had to do, and I'd do it again if I had to. Now stop arguing with me and close your eyes for a few minutes. I'll wake you if anything happens." Abner wanted to protest further, but he was too tired to put up much of a fight. He leaned back in the uncomfortable plastic chair and let his eyes drift shut. Just for a moment. Just to rest them. The storm continued its assault on the building outside, and somewhere in the back of his consciousness he was aware of Marjorie moving around the station, checking doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. He heard her footsteps retreat toward the office, and then there was nothing but the wind and his own breathing and the darkness behind his eyelids pulling him down into sleep. Abner woke to the sound of something scraping across concrete, a slow, deliberate sound that didn't belong in the empty quiet of the station. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was, or why every part of his body hurt, and then it all came rushing back. The storm, the garage, Silas and the wrench and Marjorie with her pipe. He opened his eyes and found himself still in the plastic chair near the windows, the storm still visible outside, though maybe not quite as violent as it had been before. The sky beyond the snow was starting to lighten, suggesting dawn wasn't far off, and he realized he'd been asleep for hours. The scraping sound came again, and Abner's head snapped toward the doorway that led to the garage, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. He pushed himself up from the chair, biting back a groan as his injured wrist protested the movement, and looked around for Marjorie. She was slumped over the counter with her head on her arms, asleep, the coffee pot beside her cold and empty. She'd tried to stay awake and keep watch, but exhaustion had claimed her just like it had claimed Abner, and now they were both vulnerable if Silas had somehow gotten free of his restraints. The scraping sound came a third time, louder now, definitely coming from the garage, and Abner knew he had to check it, even though every instinct screamed at him to grab Marjorie and run out into the storm. He couldn't run, not with his injuries, not with the weather still deadly outside, and he couldn't leave without knowing what was happening back there. He moved as quietly as he could toward the doorway, his boots making soft sounds on the gritty floor, and peered around the frame into the garage. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. Silas was awake and moving, dragging himself across the concrete floor with his bound hands and feet, leaving a trail of blood behind him from where his head wound had opened up again. He was making for the workbench, for the tools scattered across its surface, and Abner realized with a sick certainty that the man was going to try to cut himself free. If he managed that, if he got loose before the police arrived, then everything that had happened tonight would have been for nothing. Silas would come after them again, and this time he might succeed. Abner stepped into the garage and Silas's head came up, his eyes focusing on the trucker with an expression that was equal parts hatred and pain. His face was a mess, his nose clearly broken and bent at an unnatural angle, his lips split and swollen, dried blood caked across his cheeks and chin. But his eyes were alert and aware, burning with a rage that hadn't been diminished by unconsciousness or injury. He opened his mouth and tried to speak, but all that came out was a wet, gurgling sound. And then he coughed and spat blood onto the concrete. He tried again, and this time managed to form words, though they were slurred and barely intelligible. "Should have killed you when I had the chance," Silas rasped, his voice thick and ruined. "Should have bashed your skull in the second you walked through that door, instead of playing with you. That's always been my problem, you know. I like to talk, like to see the fear in their eyes when they realize what's happening. But you're different. You fought back. Nobody ever fights back?" Abner didn't respond. He was scanning the garage for something he could use as a weapon, something to defend himself if Silas somehow managed to get free. His eyes landed on the iron pipe Marjorie had used, lying where she'd dropped it near the car lift, and he moved toward it, keeping his eyes on Silas the whole time. The smaller man watched him with those burning eyes, and despite the ropes binding his limbs, despite the blood and the obvious pain, there was something unbroken in him, something that refused to accept defeat. It made Abner nervous in a way the earlier fight hadn't. A desperate man was dangerous, but a man who had nothing left to lose was something else entirely. "Police are coming," Abner said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "Probably be here within the hour now that the storm's letting up. They're going to find everything you did, everyone you killed. They're going to dig up your backyard and identify every body, and your name is going to be in every newspaper in the country. Is that what you want? To be remembered as a monster?" Silas laughed, a horrible, wet sound that turned into a coughing fit. When he could speak again, his voice was even rougher than before. "Don't care about being remembered," he said. "Don't care about nothing except making sure you don't walk out of here. You think you won something, trucker man. You think because that waitress hit me and tied me up that this is over. It ain't over. Not until one of us is dead." He started dragging himself forward again, faster this time, his bound hands clawing at the concrete and pulling his body along with a determination that was almost admirable in its single-mindedness. Abner picked up the pipe and hefted it, feeling its weight, and positioned himself between Silas and the workbench. He didn't want to hit the man again, didn't want to risk killing him or causing permanent damage, but he would if he had to. Self-defense, the police would call it. Justified use of force, but Abner knew that no matter what legal terms they put on it, he'd have to live with the memory of bringing a pipe down on another human being's skull, even if that human being was a serial killer who'd been trying to murder him. "Stay down," Abner said, raising the pipe slightly. "I don't want to hurt you again, but I will if you keep coming. Just stay down and wait for the police like a rational person." Rational. Silas spat the word like it was poison. "You want me to be rational? There ain't nothing rational about any of this. You came into my place, my sanctuary, and you ruined everything. 23 years I kept this going. 23 years, and nobody ever figured it out. Then you show up with your broken truck and your nosy questions, and suddenly it's all falling apart. So don't talk to me about being rational. Rational went out the window the second you walked through that door." He lunged forward suddenly, his bound legs kicking out and propelling him across the remaining distance between himself and Abner faster than should have been possible for a man in his condition. Abner swung the pipe reflexively, aiming for Silas's shoulder to disable rather than kill. But Silas rolled at the last second and the pipe struck the concrete instead, sending a jarring vibration up Abner's arms. Silas kept rolling and crashed into Abner's legs, his bound hands grabbing at the trucker's ankles, trying to pull him down. Abner stumbled and nearly fell, catching himself against the car lift with his good hand, and kicked out, trying to dislodge Silas. His boot connected with the man's ribs, and he felt something give way. Heard Silas grunt in pain, but the mechanic's grip didn't loosen. They struggled there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Silas trying to pull Abner down to the floor where he could bring the pipe to bear effectively. Abner trying to stay upright and keep his weapon. The pipe fell from Abner's hand with a clatter and rolled away, and suddenly the fight was reduced to its most basic elements. Two men grappling for dominance. Neither one willing to give in, both knowing that losing meant death. Abner brought his knee up hard into Silas's face, feeling the broken nose crunch further under the impact. And finally the mechanic's grip loosened. Abner pulled free and scrambled backward, breathing hard, and Silas lay on the floor making sounds that might have been crying or laughing or both. "Just give up," Abner said, his voice ragged. "You've lost, Silas. It's over. Stop fighting, and maybe you'll live long enough to stand trial. To at least tell your side of things. Isn't that better than dying here in this garage?" Silas rolled onto his back and stared up at the ceiling, his chest heaving, blood running from his nose and mouth down his neck and soaking into his coveralls. For a moment, Abner thought he was going to pass out again, hoped he would pass out and stay that way until the authorities arrived. But then Silas started laughing again, that same terrible wet sound, and turned his head to look at Abner with eyes that held nothing but contempt. "You still don't get it," Silas said. "There is no my side. There's just what I did and why I did it, and none of it matters now? You want to know the truth? I didn't enjoy it, not really. Wasn't some sick thrill or power trip. It was just something to do, something to give my days meaning when everything else had been taken away. Those people who died here, they were already lost, already disconnected from the world in ways they didn't even understand. I just helped them finish what they'd started. And yeah, maybe that makes me a monster in your eyes, but at least I'm a monster who admits what he is. At least I don't pretend to be something I'm not." The rationalization was chilling in its casualness. The way Silas had convinced himself that his victims had somehow deserved or wanted what happened to them. Abner had met plenty of people over the years who refused to take responsibility for their actions, who blamed circumstances or other people or fate itself for the choices they made. But this was something different. This was a complete abdication of morality, a rejection of the basic social contract that said you don't get to decide who lives and who dies based on your own twisted logic. And the worst part was that Silas genuinely seemed to believe what he was saying, seemed to think he'd been providing some kind of service by murdering travelers who had the misfortune to break down near his station. Before Abner could respond, he heard a sound from the main room, the scrape of a chair being pushed back, footsteps approaching. Marjorie appeared in the doorway looking disheveled and frightened, her eyes going immediately to Silas on the floor and then to Abner standing over him. She took in the scene quickly, the pipe lying nearby, the fresh blood on the concrete, the way both men were breathing hard and staring at each other with naked hostility. And something in her expression hardened. She walked over to where the pipe lay and picked it up, holding it in both hands, and positioned herself beside Abner. "Is he trying to escape?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear Abner could see in her eyes. "He was heading for the tools," Abner said, trying to cut himself loose. "I stopped him." Marjorie nodded slowly and looked down at Silas with an expression that might have been pity or disgust, or some combination of both. "The police called while you were back here," she said. "They've cleared the highway and they're on their way. Said they should be here in 20 minutes, maybe less. We just have to hold on a little longer." 20 minutes. Abner felt some of the tension drain from his shoulders at the news. 20 minutes was manageable, was survivable. They could watch Silas for 20 minutes, could make sure he didn't get free or hurt himself or do anything else that might complicate the situation further. And then this nightmare would be over, and Abner could go home to his wife and his life and try to forget this place ever existed. Except he knew he'd never really forget. Knew that the memory of this night would stay with him forever. The photographs on the wall, the bloodstain on the floor, the look in Silas's eyes as he talked about killing people like it was no more significant than changing oil in a car. Silas was staring at Marjorie now, his expression unreadable. "You know I never would have hurt you, right, Marjorie?" he said, his voice softer than before, almost pleading. "All those years you brought me food and kept me company when I was lonely. You were a friend to me, a real friend. I wouldn't have done to you what I did to the others. You got to believe that." "I don't believe anything you say," Marjorie replied, her voice cold. "I don't even recognize you anymore, Silas. The man I thought I knew, the man I felt sorry for and tried to help, that person never existed. You were just wearing a mask this whole time, pretending to be human while you did inhuman things. So don't talk to me about friendship or loyalty or anything else, because those words don't mean anything coming from you." Silas's face twisted with something that might have been genuine hurt, and for a moment Abner almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then he remembered the drawer full of IDs, remembered the photographs of all those smiling faces that would never smile again, and any sympathy he might have felt evaporated like morning dew in the sun. Silas had made his choices, had lived his life according to his own twisted code, and now he was going to pay the price for it. That was justice, cold and impersonal and inevitable, and Abner took comfort in knowing that at least this one time the system would work the way it was supposed to. They stood there in silence for a while. Abner and Marjorie watching Silas, who lay on the floor bleeding and broken, but still somehow defiant. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness, each one feeling like an hour, and Abner found himself checking the windows compulsively for any sign of approaching vehicles. The storm had definitely weakened, the snow falling in lazy flakes now instead of the horizontal wall of white it had been earlier, and visibility had improved to maybe 100 yards. The roads would still be treacherous, still covered in drifts and ice, but they were passable if you had the right equipment and took your time. Finally, blessedly, Abner heard the sound of engines in the distance, growing steadily louder. He moved to the window and saw a convoy of vehicles approaching. 2 police cruisers leading the way, followed by an ambulance and what looked like a crime scene investigation van. Help had arrived. The nightmare was really ending. He felt his knees go weak with relief and had to lean against the window frame to keep from collapsing. Marjorie came up beside him and put a hand on his shoulder, and he could feel her trembling, or maybe that was his own body shaking. He couldn't tell anymore. They watched as the vehicles pulled into the parking lot and uniformed officers piled out, moving with practiced efficiency toward the station entrance. The next hour passed in a blur of activity that Abner struggled to follow through the haze of exhaustion and pain. The officers secured Silas and loaded him into the ambulance after the paramedics had checked his injuries and declared him stable enough to transport. They took statements from both Abner and Marjorie, asking the same questions multiple times in slightly different ways, trying to piece together exactly what had happened. They photographed everything: the garage, the bloodstains, the tool chest with its drawer full of IDs, the photographs on the wall. They brought in a cadaver dog that immediately alerted in several places in the woods behind the station, and Abner watched through the window as officers marked locations with bright orange flags that stood out stark against the white snow. A paramedic examined Abner's injuries and informed him that his wrist was definitely broken and probably needed surgery to set properly. They splinted it temporarily and gave him something for the pain, and suddenly the world took on a distant, dreamy quality that made everything seem less real and less immediate. He answered more questions from detectives who arrived in unmarked cars, telling them about finding the IDs and the photographs, about Silas's confession, about everything that had happened in the garage. He told them about the medical supplies in his trailer and gave them the contact information for the hospital that was expecting the delivery, and they assured him they'd make sure the supplies got where they needed to go. By the time they were done with him, the sun was fully up and the storm had passed completely, leaving behind a landscape of pristine white snow that sparkled in the morning light. It would have been beautiful if Abner hadn't known what was buried beneath that snow, how many lives had ended in this isolated place that looked so peaceful and innocent. The detectives told him he was free to go, but that they'd need him to come back in a few days to sign his official statement and possibly testify before a grand jury. They arranged for a tow truck to retrieve his Peterbilt and a rental car to get him home, and Abner found himself sitting in the driver's seat of an unfamiliar vehicle with no clear memory of how he'd gotten there. Marjorie knocked on his window before he could drive away, and he rolled it down to talk to her. She looked as exhausted as he felt, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed from crying or lack of sleep or both. But there was something else there, too, something harder and more resilient, like she'd discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "You going to be okay?" she asked, and Abner noticed she was asking him instead of the other way around, which seemed backward given what she'd been through. "I think so," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "You?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I keep thinking about all the times I was here, all the conversations I had with him, wondering if I could have done something different, said something that might have made him stop or at least made him get help. But I guess that's not how it works, is it? You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. Can't make someone be good if they've decided they want to be evil." "He made his choices," Abner said firmly. "Whatever he did, whatever he was, that's on him, not you. You need to remember that when the guilt tries to creep in, and it will try. You did everything right. You called the police, you came back when you could have run, you stopped him when he was going to kill me. You're a hero, Marjorie. Don't let anyone tell you different." She smiled at that, a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and patted his arm through the open window. "Drive safe," she said, "and maybe stay off mountain passes for a while, at least until the memories aren't so fresh." Abner promised he would, and then rolled up the window and put the rental car in gear. He drove slowly out of the parking lot, taking one last look at the service station in his rearview mirror. The place looked innocuous in the morning light, just another rundown building on a lonely stretch of mountain road, giving no hint of the horrors that had occurred within its walls. He wondered what would happen to it now, whether it would be torn down or preserved as some kind of morbid tourist attraction, whether people would drive miles out of their way to see where Silas Creedy had killed all those people. He hoped they'd tear it down, erase it from existence, let the mountain reclaim the land and cover over the scars. The drive home took longer than it should have because Abner kept having to pull over, his hands shaking too badly to maintain a steady grip on the wheel, his vision blurring with tears he couldn't quite explain. He'd survived, had come through an encounter with a serial killer and lived to tell about it. But somehow that victory felt hollow. He kept thinking about all the people who hadn't survived, who'd stopped at that station on some random day thinking they were safe and had never been seen again. He thought about their families, about the years they'd spent wondering and hoping and gradually accepting that their loved ones were gone. And he thought about how close he'd come to joining that number, to becoming just another face on Silas's wall. When he finally made it home, 3 hours late and looking like he'd been through a war, his wife took one look at him and burst into tears. She'd been calling his cell phone all night, had been frantic when he didn't answer, had been about to call the police to report him missing when he'd finally walked through the door. He held her with his good arm and let her cry, not trusting himself to speak, and tried to figure out how he was going to explain what had happened without terrifying her further. In the end, he just told her the bare facts. His truck had broken down, he'd walked to a service station. The owner had turned out to be dangerous. The police had arrived and arrested him. He left out the details about being tied up and beaten, about the drawer full of IDs and the photographs of the dead, about how close he'd come to being murdered in that garage. She'd learn about it eventually, he knew, when the news broke and Silas's crimes became public knowledge. But for now, for today, he just wanted to be home and safe and alive. Over the next few weeks, Abner followed the news coverage of the case with a mixture of fascination and horror. The police had found 37 bodies buried on Silas's property, some of them dating back more than 20 years. They'd identified most of them through dental records and DNA, had contacted the families, had held press conferences where they talked about the scope of the crimes and the investigation that was still ongoing. Silas had been charged with multiple counts of murder and was being held without bail while he awaited trial. His lawyer had already indicated they would be pursuing an insanity defense, claiming Silas was mentally ill and not responsible for his actions, but the prosecutor was confident they could prove premeditation and get a conviction. Abner testified before the grand jury like he'd been asked to, spending 2 hours going over every detail of that night in the station. The prosecutor seemed satisfied with his testimony and told him he'd probably be called as a witness at trial when it eventually happened, which could be months or even years from now given how complex the case was. Abner said he'd be there, that he owed it to the victims to help make sure Silas was held accountable, even though the thought of having to see the man again made his stomach turn. He'd been having nightmares about that night, waking up in a cold sweat with the feeling of hands around his throat, or the sound of that wrench striking concrete echoing in his ears. His doctor had prescribed medication to help him sleep and recommended therapy to deal with the trauma, and Abner had reluctantly agreed to try it. His trucking company had been incredibly understanding about the whole situation, had given him paid leave to recover from his injuries and deal with the psychological aftermath. They'd even offered him a desk job if he didn't feel comfortable going back on the road, but Abner had declined. He wasn't going to let Silas Creedy take away something he loved, wasn't going to let fear dictate how he lived his life. So, as soon as his wrist healed and his doctor cleared him for work, he climbed back into his truck and started making runs again. It was harder than he'd expected. Every lonely stretch of road made him nervous. Every isolated building made him think of that service station. Every storm made him remember the blizzard that had nearly killed him. But he pushed through it, took the routes he was assigned, made his deliveries on time. He never drove through Eagle Pass again, though. Whenever he had a run that would take him that direction, he requested an alternate route even if it added hours to his trip. His dispatcher never questioned it, never asked why, just quietly rerouted him around that particular section of highway. Abner was grateful for the consideration, even though he knew he couldn't avoid that place forever. Eventually, he'd have to face it, have to drive past the location where the service station had stood and prove to himself that it couldn't hurt him anymore. But that day was far in the future, and for now, he was content to take the long way around. 3 months after that night, Abner received a letter in the mail from Marjorie. She'd moved away from the town near Eagle Pass, couldn't stand living there anymore with everyone looking at her and whispering about how she'd been friends with a serial killer. She'd gotten a job at a diner in Denver and was starting over, trying to build a new life away from the memories and the guilt. She wrote that she still had nightmares about hitting Silas with that pipe, still sometimes woke up certain that she'd killed him and would be arrested for murder. But she was seeing a therapist and taking medication and slowly learning to live with what had happened. She thanked Abner for what he'd said to her that morning, about being a hero and doing everything right, and said those words had helped her more than he could know. She hoped he was healing too, both physically and mentally, and she hoped their paths would cross again someday under better circumstances. Abner wrote back immediately, a long letter in which he shared his own struggles and his own nightmares, and his own slow journey toward something that might eventually resemble recovery. He told her that she'd saved his life, and he would never forget that, would be grateful to her for the rest of his days. He told her that if she ever needed anything, ever wanted to talk to someone who understood what she'd been through, she could call him any time, day or night, and he'd be there. They corresponded regularly after that, became friends in a way that only people who've survived something terrible together can be friends, bonded by shared trauma and mutual understanding. The trial happened eventually, 18 months after that night in the garage. Silas pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt and his own confession to Abner about what he'd done. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and Abner testified for an entire day, reliving every moment of his ordeal in excruciating detail for the jury. Silas sat at the defense table the whole time staring at him with those burning eyes, never showing any emotion or remorse, and Abner stared right back, refusing to be intimidated. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts, and the judge sentenced Silas to life in prison without possibility of parole. Justice had been served, or at least as much justice as was possible for crimes that could never truly be paid for. But sometimes late at night when Abner was alone on the road, when he was driving through darkness with nothing but his headlights to guide him, he found himself thinking about that service station and wondering what would have happened if the storm had been less severe, if his truck hadn't broken down, if he'd made different choices that had led him somewhere else. Would Silas still be killing people, still collecting IDs and taking photographs, still burying bodies in the woods behind his station? Or would someone else have stumbled onto his secret and ended his reign of terror? There was no way to know, no way to untangle the web of chance and circumstance that had put Abner in that place at that time, and eventually he stopped trying to figure it out. What he knew for certain was that he'd survived something that 37 other people hadn't, and that knowledge carried weight he hadn't expected. He felt an obligation to live well, to make the most of the life he'd been given, to honor the memory of those who hadn't been as lucky. So he drove his routes and came home to his wife and spent time with his daughter and tried to find meaning in the ordinary rhythms of existence. And if sometimes the shadows seemed darker than they should be, if sometimes he checked his rearview mirror more often than necessary, if sometimes he avoided certain roads and certain places without fully understanding why, well, those were small prices to pay for being alive. Leland Briscoe had driven Loveland Pass more times than he could count, but he'd never driven it this late at night and never in conditions quite like these. It was pushing 2 in the morning on a November night when the moon was nothing but a thin slice of silver behind the clouds, and the road ahead of him twisted and curved through the darkness like a snake trying to shake something off its back. The headlights of his Kenworth illuminated maybe 50 feet of asphalt before the beam just seemed to give up and let the darkness win. And beyond that, there was nothing but the vague suggestion of mountains rising up on either side like the walls of some massive tomb. The pass was notorious even in good weather. Elevation over 11,000 feet, grades that could hit 7%, hairpin turns that required you to slow to a crawl unless you wanted to find out what it felt like to go over the edge with 40,000 pounds of cargo pushing you into oblivion. But Leland had a deadline to meet and a load of industrial equipment that was already 2 days late, and the dispatcher had made it very clear that another delay would mean finding a new job. So here he was, alone on one of the most dangerous stretches of highway in Colorado, with nothing but the sound of his engine and the hiss of his tires on cold pavement to keep him company. The radio had given up trying to find a signal about 20 miles back, leaving him with nothing but static if he bothered to turn it on, and his phone showed no bars, which meant he was completely cut off from the rest of the world up here. That didn't particularly bother Leland. He'd been driving trucks for 31 years and had spent more nights alone on dark highways than he could count, had learned to enjoy the solitude in a way that most people never understood. There was something peaceful about being the only person awake for miles in any direction, the only set of eyes watching the road unfold in the headlights, the only consciousness navigating through the sleeping world. It made him feel connected to something larger than himself, made him feel like he was part of the machinery that kept civilization running, even when everyone else was dreaming in their warm beds. The temperature gauge on his dashboard read 23 degrees, cold enough that his breath would have misted if the cab wasn't heated, cold enough that any moisture on the road would be frozen solid and waiting to send an unwary driver into a slide. Leland kept his speed steady at 40 miles per hour on the straightaways and dropped to 25 on the curves, his hands light on the wheel, his eyes constantly scanning ahead for any sign of ice or debris or wildlife that might wander onto the highway. He'd seen plenty of elk and deer up here over the years, had even seen a bear once crossing the road in the early morning light, and hitting one of those animals at speed would mean a totaled truck and probably a dead driver. So he stayed alert, stayed focused, and tried not to think about how tired he was or how much his back ached from sitting in the same position for the last 8 hours. That's when he saw the figure on the side of the road. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a tree or a rock formation that his exhausted brain was interpreting as something human. But as he got closer, the figure resolved itself into a man, or at least something man-shaped, standing maybe 20 feet off the highway on what looked like the shoulder, though it was hard to tell where the road ended and the wilderness began up here. The man was waving both arms over his head in the universal signal for help, his movements frantic and desperate, and Leland felt his stomach drop. He'd passed plenty of stranded motorists over the years, people whose cars had broken down or who'd slid off the road in bad weather, and his policy had always been to stop and render assistance if he safely could. But something about this situation felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Wrong time, wrong place, wrong everything. He started to slow down anyway, because that's what you did when someone needed help. That's what any decent human being would do. But then his headlights fully illuminated the man, and Leland saw details that made him reconsider. The man was old, maybe 70 or 80, with a long white beard that hung down to the middle of his chest and wild hair that stuck out from under a knit cap, like he'd been electrocuted. He was wearing clothes that looked like they'd come from another era entirely. Heavy canvas pants held up with suspenders, a thick wool jacket that was patched in multiple places, boots that were so worn the leather was cracked and separating from the soles. But what really caught Leland's attention was the fact that there was no vehicle anywhere nearby. No car or truck pulled off on the shoulder, no bicycle or motorcycle. Nothing to explain how this man had gotten up here, or what he was doing standing on the side of Loveland Pass at 2 a.m, waving for help. Leland's foot hovered over the brake pedal, his mind racing through possibilities. Maybe the man's vehicle had gone over the edge, and he was the only survivor. Maybe he'd been hiking and gotten lost and was desperate enough to flag down a truck for help. Maybe he was a crazy person who lived up here in the mountains and had decided tonight was the night to interact with civilization. Or maybe, and this was the thought that made Leland's hands tighten on the wheel, maybe this was some kind of setup, some kind of trap designed to get a lone trucker to stop in the middle of nowhere so he could be robbed or carjacked, or worse. Leland had heard stories from other drivers about that kind of thing happening. People using fake emergencies to lure good Samaritans into vulnerable positions, and he'd always told himself he wouldn't fall for it if it ever happened to him. But as he drew level with the old man and got a good look at his face, Leland saw genuine terror there, genuine desperation, and his foot moved to the brake almost against his will. The man's eyes were wide and white in the darkness, his mouth open like he was shouting something, though Leland couldn't hear it over the sound of his engine, and his whole body language screamed of someone who was running from something or towards something and needed help right now, or bad things were going to happen. Leland had been around enough frightened people in his life to recognize the real thing when he saw it, and whatever else this old man might be, he wasn't faking his fear. So Leland made a decision that he would spend the rest of the night questioning, and probably longer than that. He brought the truck to a stop on the shoulder, put it in neutral, set the air brake, and reached for the door handle. The cold hit him like a physical blow when he stepped out of the cab, the wind cutting through his jacket and his jeans like they were made of tissue paper. The temperature had to have dropped another 10 degrees since he'd last checked, and Leland could feel his eyes starting to water from the bitter air. He zipped his jacket up to his chin and pulled his own knit cap down over his ears, then walked around the front of his truck toward where the old man was standing. Up close, the man looked even more disheveled than he had from the cab. His beard matted and tangled, his face weathered and lined with deep wrinkles that spoke of decades spent outdoors. His eyes were a pale blue, almost colorless, and they fixed on Leland with an intensity that was uncomfortable to meet. "Thank God," the old man said, his voice rough and raspy like he hadn't used it in a while. "Thank God you stopped. I've been standing here for 2 hours, watching trucks go by, and not one of them would stop. Not one. Thought I was going to freeze to death before someone finally showed some Christian charity." "What are you doing up here?" Leland asked, his own breath misting in the air between them. "Where's your vehicle? Are you hurt?" The old man shook his head, a jerky movement that looked almost spasmodic. "No vehicle," he said. "I walked. Came up from the old mining camp down in the valley. Must be 10 miles from here. Been walking since sunset trying to make it to the ranger station, but I don't think I can go no further. Too cold, too tired, and my heart's not what it used to be. I need a ride, need to get down the mountain, need to get somewhere warm before I freeze solid." Leland looked past the old man into the darkness, trying to see if there was anyone else out there, any sign that this was something other than what it appeared to be. He couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except the wind and the idle of his truck's engine. But that didn't necessarily mean they were alone. "Why were you walking up here in the middle of the night?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral and non-threatening. "Why not wait until morning when it's light and warmer?" The old man's face twisted into something that might have been a grimace or a smile. It was hard to tell. "Couldn't wait," he said. "Had to get out of there tonight, had to get away before they came back. Thought if I could make it to the ranger station I'd be safe. Thought maybe I could get someone to listen to me for once instead of treating me like I'm crazy. But I'm not crazy. I know what I saw, know what they did, and someone needs to pay for it. Someone needs to answer for all those boys who never came home." Leland felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The old man's words had taken on a rambling quality, jumping from one thought to another without clear connection, and his eyes had gone distant and unfocused like he was seeing something that wasn't there. This was exactly the kind of situation Leland had been worried about, exactly the kind of person who might be unstable or dangerous or both. But at the same time, he couldn't just leave the man out here to freeze. That would be murder, or at least manslaughter, and Leland had no intention of having something like that on his conscience for the rest of his life. "All right," Leland said slowly, making his decision. "I can give you a ride down to the ranger station or into town, whichever's closer, but I need you to understand something first. I'm doing this as a favor, as one human being helping another, but I'm not going to tolerate any nonsense. You try anything strange, you make me uncomfortable in any way, and I'm putting you back out on the side of the road regardless of the weather. Are we clear?" The old man nodded eagerly, his face breaking into a gap-toothed smile. "Clear as crystal," he said. "I appreciate it more than you know, friend. Name's Ephraim Dunbar. Been living in these mountains most of my life. Used to work the mines back when there was still work to be had, before they closed everything down and left us to rot. I won't give you no trouble, I promise. Just need to get down the mountain and tell someone what I know before it's too late." Leland gestured toward the passenger side of the cab. "Let's get you inside where it's warm," he said. "We can talk more once we're moving." He climbed back up into the cab and leaned over to unlock the passenger door from the inside, then waited while Ephraim made his way around the front of the truck. The old man moved slowly, his gait stiff and limping, and it took him 3 tries to pull himself up into the cab. Once he was settled in the passenger seat, Leland got a better look at him in the dome light and didn't like what he saw. Ephraim's clothes were even more ragged than they'd appeared outside, with tears and stains that suggested he'd been living rough for a while. His hands were filthy, the nails black with grime, and there was a smell coming off him that was equal parts body odor and something else, something sweet and rotten that made Leland want to roll down the windows despite the cold. But more concerning than any of that was the look in Ephraim's eyes when the light hit them. They weren't just distant anymore. They were haunted, filled with shadows and memories that clearly gave him no peace. This was a man who'd seen things, done things, experienced things that had broken something fundamental inside him, and Leland suddenly wondered if giving him a ride had been a terrible mistake. But it was too late now. Ephraim was in the cab, the door was closed, and Leland couldn't very well throw him back out into the cold without at least giving him a chance to prove he was harmless. Leland released the air brake and put the truck in gear, easing back onto the highway and gradually building up speed. The cab was silent except for the sound of the engine and the heater blowing warm air, and Leland found himself hyper-aware of every movement Ephraim made, every shift of his body, every breath he took. The old man sat perfectly still for the first few minutes, staring out the windshield at the road ahead, and then he started talking. At first it was just muttering, words too low and jumbled for Leland to make out, but gradually the muttering became clearer and took on the quality of a story being told, or maybe a confession being made. "They think nobody knows," Ephraim said, his voice still rough but steadier now that he was warming up. "Think they covered their tracks well enough that nobody would ever figure it out. But I know. I was there. I saw what happened to those boys, saw what they did to them, and I tried to tell people at the time, but nobody wanted to listen. Said I was drunk, said I was making things up for attention, said I was just another crazy old miner who couldn't accept that the good days were over. But I wasn't drunk and I wasn't crazy. I know what I saw." Leland kept his eyes on the road, but couldn't help asking, "What did you see, Ephraim?" The old man turned to look at him, and in the dim glow from the dashboard his face looked skull-like, all sharp angles and deep shadows. "Murder," he said simply. "Saw them kill those boys one by one and throw their bodies down the old shaft where nobody would ever find them. Must be 20 of them down there by now, maybe more. All young men who came to work the mines, all of them promised good wages and a fresh start, and all of them ended up dead because they saw something they shouldn't have seen or asked questions they shouldn't have asked. The foreman, he ran that mine like his own private kingdom, and anyone who challenged him or threatened his authority ended up disappearing. We all knew it, all of us who worked there, but we were too scared to say anything, too scared they'd come for us next." Leland felt his hands tighten on the wheel. This was worse than he'd thought, much worse. Either Ephraim was telling the truth about witnessing multiple murders, which would make him a valuable witness but also potentially dangerous if the killers thought he might talk, or he was delusional and had invented this entire story in his mind, which would make him unpredictable and possibly violent. Either way, Leland was now trapped in a moving vehicle with a man who was deeply disturbed, and the nearest town was still 30 miles away down a winding mountain road in the middle of the night. "When did this happen?" Leland asked, trying to keep his voice calm and conversational. "When were these men killed?" Ephraim's face scrunched up as he thought about it. "Started in the winter of '58, he said. "I remember because that was the year Kennedy was elected, and everyone was so hopeful things were going to change. But nothing changed, not for us. First one was a kid named Billy something or other, came up from Texas looking for work. He was only 18, barely old enough to shave, and he had this way of talking that rubbed the foreman wrong. Always asking questions, always wanting to know why we did things a certain way. One day, he just didn't show up for his shift, and the foreman said he'd quit and gone back to Texas. But I saw Billy's bunk that night, and all his stuff was still there. His clothes, his boots, even his wallet with his money in it. No man leaves without his wallet. So I knew something was wrong." The story was detailed, specific, with the kind of small particulars that suggested either real memory or an extremely elaborate delusion. Leland didn't know which was worse. "And you think the foreman killed him?" "No, he did," Ephraim said with absolute certainty. "Saw it with my own eyes a few months later when it happened again. Different kid, same story. This one had caught the foreman stealing from the company, skimming gold dust and selling it on the side. He was going to report it, was going to go to the owners and tell them what was happening. So the foreman and 2 of his cronies cornered him in one of the deep shafts, beat him to death with pickaxe handles, and threw his body down into the abandoned section where the walls had collapsed. I was working nearby, heard the whole thing through the rock. Heard that boy screaming and begging and then heard him stop. And I didn't do nothing about it. Just kept my head down and my mouth shut because I wanted to live." There was real anguish in Ephraim's voice now, real guilt, and despite his misgivings, Leland felt a stirring of sympathy for the old man. If even half of what he was saying was true, he'd spent decades living with the knowledge that he'd been complicit in murder through his silence, that his cowardice had allowed other men to die. That kind of guilt could eat away at a person from the inside, could turn them into exactly the kind of haunted shell that Ephraim had become. "Why are you talking about it now?" Leland asked. "If this happened back in the '50s, that's over 60 years ago. Everyone involved is probably dead by now." Ephraim shook his head violently. "Not all of them," he said. "The foreman's still alive, still living down in the valley in that big house he built with blood money. Must be 90 years old by now, but he's still there. Still walking around free while those boys are rotting in the ground. And that's not right. That's not justice. Someone needs to pay. Someone needs to answer for what was done, and I'm the only one left who knows the truth. Everyone else who worked in that mine is dead or gone, scattered to the 4 winds. But I stayed. I couldn't leave, couldn't abandon those boys even though they're dead. Felt like if I left, if I stopped remembering them, then they'd really be gone. So I stayed in that old mining camp all these years, living in the ruins, trying to work up the courage to tell someone what I know." The mining camp. Leland knew about the old camps scattered throughout these mountains, abandoned settlements that had sprung up during Colorado's mining boom and then died when the gold ran out or the companies went bankrupt. Most of them were nothing but foundations and collapsed buildings now. Too remote and too damaged to be worth preserving, and the few that remained standing were used mostly by hikers and squatters. The idea that Ephraim had been living in one of those ruins for decades, alone with his guilt and his memories, was both tragic and deeply unsettling. "Why tonight?" Leland pressed. "Why did you decide to walk 10 miles in freezing weather in the middle of the night? Why not wait until morning and get a ride from someone?" Ephraim's face went dark, his expression shifting from guilt to fear in the space of a heartbeat. "Because they came back," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The foreman's grandson, he came to the camp yesterday. Don't know how he knew I was there. Don't know what he wanted. But he had questions. Was asking about the old mine, about the men who used to work there, about whether anyone was still alive who remembered those days. And the way he looked at me, the way he talked, he knows. He knows what his grandfather did, and he's trying to tie up loose ends, trying to make sure nobody can ever tell the story. Nobody can ever prove what happened. So I ran, waited until dark and started walking, figured if I could just get to the authorities and tell them everything before they found me, maybe those boys could finally get justice." It was a paranoid fantasy, had to be. The idea that someone would hunt down a 90-year-old witness to crimes committed over 60 years ago was absurd on its face, but the fear in Ephraim's voice was real, and the desperation that had made him walk 10 miles through the cold was real, and Leland found himself wondering if maybe there was more to this story than simple delusion. Maybe Ephraim really had witnessed murders back in the 50s. Maybe there really were bodies in an abandoned mine shaft somewhere. And maybe, just maybe, someone really did want to keep that secret buried along with the dead. The road ahead curved sharply to the right, and Leland downshifted, feeling the truck slow as he navigated the turn. They were descending now, dropping elevation as they wound their way down the eastern side of the pass, and in another 20 minutes they'd reach the town of Idaho Springs, where there was a sheriff's station and a hospital, and people who could help Ephraim, or at least evaluate whether he needed psychiatric care. Leland just needed to keep the old man calm and cooperative until they got there, needed to avoid spooking him or saying anything that might trigger an episode if he was genuinely mentally ill. "I believe you," Leland said, even though he wasn't sure that was entirely true. "And I think you're doing the right thing by going to the authorities. They'll be able to investigate your claims, check out the old mine, see if there's any evidence to support what you're saying. But you need to understand that it's been a long time, and memory can play tricks on us. Are you absolutely certain about what you saw?" Ephraim turned to look at him with those pale, colorless eyes, and there was something ancient and terrible in them that made Leland want to look away. "I'm certain," the old man said. "I can still hear their screams when I close my eyes. I can still see their faces, young and scared and not understanding why this was happening to them. I've spent 60 years living with those memories, and they haven't faded even a little bit. If anything, they've gotten sharper, more clear, like my mind is trying to make sure I never forget. So, yeah, I'm certain. Question is, will anyone believe me? Or am I just a crazy old man telling impossible stories?" Before Leland could answer, the truck's headlights swept across something on the road ahead that made his heart skip a beat. There was a vehicle parked across both lanes, blocking the highway completely, and as Leland hit the brakes and started slowing down, he could see it was an old pickup truck, dark green or maybe brown, with rust eating through the wheel wells and a windshield that was cracked in a spiderweb pattern. The truck's lights were off, the cab appeared empty, and there was no obvious reason for it to be sitting there in the middle of the road at 2:30 in the morning. Ephraim saw it at the same time and made a sound that was half gasp and half whimper. "That's them," he said, his voice rising in panic. "That's his truck. The grandson's truck. He followed me. He knows where I am. Oh God, we have to go back, have to turn around." "Calm down," Leland said sharply, though his own pulse was hammering in his throat. He brought his rig to a complete stop about 30 yards from the pickup, close enough to see it clearly, but far enough that he could back up and turn around if he needed to. The pass was narrow here, but there was a turnout coming up behind them that he could use to execute a 3-point turn if necessary. "We don't know that's anyone following you. Could be a breakdown, could be someone having car trouble. I'm going to go check it out, see if anyone needs help." "Don't," Ephraim pleaded, grabbing Leland's arm with fingers that dug in like claws. "Don't get out of the truck. That's what they want. They want you separated from your vehicle so they can what?" Leland interrupted, pulling his arm free. "Look, I appreciate that you're scared, but I can't just leave a vehicle blocking the road. What if someone comes around that curve going too fast and slams into it? People could die. I'm going to check it out, make sure nobody's hurt, and then we'll figure out what to do. You stay here, keep the doors locked, and don't open them for anyone but me, understand?" Ephraim didn't answer, just shrank back into his seat and stared at the truck ahead with an expression of pure terror on his face. Leland felt his own unease growing, but he pushed it down and forced himself to open the door and step out into the cold once again. The wind had picked up even more, howling down the pass and bringing with it the smell of pine and snow, and something else, something faintly metallic that Leland couldn't quite identify. He walked slowly toward the pickup truck, his boots crunching on the gravelly shoulder, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement or danger. As he got closer, he could see that the pickup was old, probably from the late 80s or early 90s, and it had seen better days. The paint was faded and peeling, the bed was dented, and one of the rear tires looked dangerously low. But what really caught Leland's attention was the fact that the driver's side door was hanging open, swaying slightly in the wind, and there was something dark on the ground beneath it. He approached cautiously, every nerve in his body screaming at him to turn around and get back in his truck, and when he got close enough to see what the dark substance was, his stomach turned. It was blood, fresh blood, still wet and glistening in the beam of his flashlight, pooled on the asphalt and trailing off toward the edge of the road. There was a lot of it, more than could have come from a minor injury, and the trail led directly toward the guardrail in the darkness beyond. Leland felt his mouth go dry as he followed the trail with his light, seeing where it disappeared over the edge, and he knew with absolute certainty that something terrible had happened here. He should call the police, should get back in his truck and drive until he had cell service and report this immediately. But some impulse he didn't fully understand made him walk to the guardrail and look over the edge. The beam of his flashlight illuminated a slope that dropped away at a steep angle, covered in rocks and scrub brush and patches of snow. About 20 feet down the slope he could see a shape that might have been a person, lying motionless in an unnatural position that suggested broken bones or worse. Leland's mind raced through his options. He could climb down there and check if the person was still alive, but the slope looked treacherous, and he had no climbing equipment. He could go back for help, but by the time he got someone up here, the person might be dead from exposure or blood loss if they weren't already. Or he could... A sound behind him made him spin around, his heart leaping into his throat. Standing maybe 10 feet away, silhouetted against his truck's headlights, was a figure. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat. The man's face was hidden in shadow, but Leland could feel eyes on him, studying him, measuring him. And suddenly, Ephraim's paranoid ramblings didn't seem quite so paranoid anymore. Leland's hand instinctively went to his belt where he kept a folding knife. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing if this turned into the kind of situation where he needed to defend himself. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there like a statue blocking the path back to Leland's truck, and the silence stretched out between them until it became almost unbearable. Leland could hear his own breathing. Loud and ragged in his ears, could hear the wind whistling through the rocks, could hear the distant rumble of his truck's engine still idling. But from the figure came nothing, no sound at all, and that somehow made it worse. "Who are you?" Leland finally managed to ask, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "This your truck? There's someone down that slope. Looks like they might be hurt bad. You know anything about that?" The figure took a step forward, and the headlights caught enough of his face for Leland to see details. He was younger than Leland had expected from the silhouette, maybe 40 or 45, with a lean, hard face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the mountains around them. His eyes were dark and deep-set, shadowed by the brim of his hat, and there was something predatory in the way he moved, something that reminded Leland of a wolf circling prey. The man's coat hung open despite the cold, and Leland could see he was wearing a flannel shirt underneath, and hanging from his belt was what looked unmistakably like a holster with the grip of a revolver visible in the dim light. "That's my grandfather down there," the man said, his voice flat and emotionless. "He's dead. Fell trying to climb down the slope, hit his head on a rock. I was going to call it in once I got back to town, but then I saw your truck coming and figured I should block the road, make sure nobody else came through until the authorities could get here. Name's Conrad Hollis. I'm the sheriff over in Silver Creek, about 15 miles from here." The explanation was reasonable, logical, exactly the kind of thing an officer of the law might do in this situation. But something about the way Conrad said it, the complete lack of emotion when talking about his grandfather being dead, made Leland's skin crawl. And there was the small matter of what Ephraim had said about the foreman's grandson coming to the mining camp, asking questions, trying to tie up loose ends. Could this be the same person? Could Conrad Hollis be the grandson Ephraim had been running from? "I'm sorry for your loss," Leland said carefully, keeping his eyes on Conrad's hands and the gun at his belt. "What was your grandfather doing up here in the middle of the night? Long way to come at this hour." Conrad's expression didn't change. "He called me earlier this evening, said he needed to see me urgently, said it was a matter of life and death. He's always been dramatic like that, always making everything into a crisis, so I didn't rush. Took my time driving up here, figured he'd wait. But when I got to the meeting spot, he wasn't there, and I found his truck here with the door open and blood on the ground. Looks like he got impatient waiting for me and decided to try to climb down to the old mining camp himself. He was always stubborn, always thought he could do things he was too old to be doing." The story had holes in it big enough to drive a truck through. If Conrad's grandfather had called him for an urgent meeting, why would the old man then climb down a dangerous slope in the dark instead of waiting? And why would Conrad block the road before calling for help if his grandfather was potentially still alive down there and in need of medical attention? And most importantly, why did Conrad look so calm and collected when talking about a family member who'd just died in a terrible accident? Leland had seen people deal with grief in different ways over the years, but this complete absence of emotion wasn't normal. It was the kind of effect you'd expect from someone who was lying, someone who'd already processed what happened because they'd been there when it happened, or maybe even caused it to happen. "You said he was going to the old mining camp," Leland said, his mind working through the implications. "Why would he be going there?" Conrad shrugged, a casual gesture that seemed grotesque given the circumstances. "No idea. He'd been acting strange lately, talking about the past, bringing up old stories from when he worked the mines. I think maybe dementia was setting in, making him confused about what was real and what was memory. He kept saying he needed to show me something, needed to make sure I understood what really happened back then. But he never made any sense when he talked about it, just rambled on about mistakes and guilt and justice. Old man talk, you know how it is." Leland did know how it was, or at least he thought he did, but he also knew what Ephraim had told him about the murders in the mine, about the bodies thrown down the shaft, about the foreman who'd killed anyone who threatened to expose his crimes. And now here was the foreman's grandson, claiming his grandfather had died in an accident while trying to reach the same mining camp where Ephraim had been living, where Ephraim claimed to have witnessed those long-ago murders. The coincidence was too perfect, too convenient, and every instinct Leland had developed over 3 decades of driving through the night and dealing with strangers was screaming at him that Conrad Hollis was lying through his teeth. "I've got someone in my truck who might know something about this," Leland said, making a decision that he knew might be dangerous but couldn't see any way around. "Old man named Ephraim Dunbar. Says he used to work at that mining camp. Flagged me down a few miles back asking for a ride. He's pretty shaken up, talking about people following him, but maybe he saw what happened to your grandfather." The change in Conrad's expression was subtle, but unmistakable. His eyes sharpened, his posture shifted slightly, and suddenly he looked less like a grieving grandson and more like a hunter who'd just spotted his quarry. "Ephraim Dunbar," he said slowly, tasting the name. "Yeah, I know that name. My grandfather mentioned him a few times, said he was the last one left from the old crew, said he'd been living rough in the abandoned camp for years, probably out of his mind by now. That who you picked up?" "That's him," Leland confirmed, watching Conrad's face carefully. "He seems pretty confused, like you said, talking about old crimes, saying people are after him. I was taking him down to Idaho Springs so he could talk to the police, get some help. But if you're a sheriff, maybe you can take him off my hands, get him the assistance he needs." Conrad nodded slowly, his hand drifting almost casually toward the gun at his belt. "Yeah, I can take care of him," he said, and there was something in his voice that made Leland's blood run cold. "Why don't you go get him? Bring him out here so we can all talk. I'd like to hear what he has to say about my grandfather. Might help me understand what the old man was thinking tonight." Every fiber of Leland's being was telling him not to do that, not to bring Ephraim out here where Conrad could get his hands on him. But he couldn't think of a good excuse to refuse without tipping Conrad off that he was suspicious, without potentially escalating the situation into violence. So he nodded and started walking back toward his truck, his mind racing through scenarios and options. He could drive away, just get in the cab and drive right past Conrad's truck, push it out of the way if he had to. The Kenworth weighed 40 tons loaded, more than enough to move an old pickup. But that would mean leaving Conrad's grandfather down the slope if he was somehow still alive, and it would mean becoming a fugitive if Conrad really was a sheriff and decided to report Leland for leaving the scene of an accident. Or he could bring Ephraim out and see what happened, try to defuse the situation through conversation and reason. But if Conrad really had killed his own grandfather to keep secrets buried, if he really was here to silence Ephraim permanently, then bringing the old miner out would be signing his death warrant. Leland would be complicit in murder, would have to live with the knowledge that he delivered a helpless old man into the hands of his killer. And that wasn't something Leland could do, wasn't something he could live with no matter what the consequences might be for refusing. He reached his truck and climbed up into the cab, pulling the door shut behind him. Ephraim was where he'd left him, pressed back into the passenger seat with his eyes wide and terrified, his hands clutching the edge of the seat so hard his knuckles were white. The moment Leland was inside, the old man started talking, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "That's him, isn't it? That's the grandson, the one who came to the camp. I told you he was following me and you didn't believe me, but I was right. He's going to kill us both, going to make it look like an accident, same as he did with all those others. We have to go, have to get out of here right now before he—" "Calm down," Leland said, though he was far from calm himself. His hands were shaking as he reached for the gear shift, and he could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. He says he's a sheriff, says his grandfather fell down the slope and died, but I don't believe him. Something about his story doesn't add up, and the way he reacted when I mentioned your name, he knows who you are, Ephraim. He knows what you know. Ephraim let out a sound that was half sob and half laugh. Of course he knows, the old man said. His grandfather told him everything before he died, made him promise to protect the family name, protect the secret. That's why he came to the camp yesterday. That's why he's here now. He's cleaning up loose ends, making sure nobody can ever tell the truth about what happened in that mine. And we're loose ends. Both of us. He can't let us leave here alive. He said his grandfather is dead down at the bottom of that slope, Leland said, putting the pieces together in his mind. But I don't think it was an accident. I think Conrad killed him. Maybe because the old man was having second thoughts about keeping the secret. Maybe because he was going to confess to what he'd done. And now Conrad needs to get rid of you before you can tell anyone what you witnessed. And he needs to get rid of me because I'm a witness to whatever he's planning to do. The logic was sound, even if it was based mostly on intuition and suspicion rather than hard evidence. But Leland had learned to trust his intuition over the years, had seen too many situations where ignoring that little voice in the back of his head had led to trouble. And right now, that voice was screaming at him to get out of here, to put as much distance as possible between himself and Conrad Hollis before things went from bad to worse. He released the air brake and started to put the truck in reverse, planning to back up to the turnout and execute his three-point turn. But before he could complete the motion, there was a sharp crack, and the windshield exploded inward in a shower of safety glass. Leland threw himself sideways instinctively, covering his face with his arms, and felt something hot graze his shoulder. A gunshot. Conrad was shooting at them. Another crack and another, and Leland heard the bullets punching through the thin metal of the cab, heard Ephraim screaming, felt the truck shudder as one round hit something vital in the engine compartment. The windshield was gone now, nothing but a frame holding a few jagged pieces of glass, and the cold wind was pouring in along with the smell of gunpowder and burnt metal. Leland's ears were ringing from the shots fired at such close range, and he couldn't hear what Ephraim was saying anymore, could only see the old man's mouth moving as he pointed frantically toward the back of the cab. Leland's hand found the gear shift, and he slammed the truck into reverse, pressing the accelerator and feeling the rig lurch backward. More shots, one of them starring the passenger side window, another punching through the hood with a metallic thunk. The truck was still moving, though, still responding to his commands, and Leland kept his foot down as he steered blind using only his mirrors. He couldn't see Conrad anymore, but he could hear the shots, could hear them getting closer as the sheriff walked toward them, firing methodically, taking his time because he knew they had nowhere to go. The road behind them was narrow and winding, with sheer drops on one side and rock walls on the other, and in the dark, with no windshield and a possibly damaged engine, Leland's chances of successfully escaping were minimal at best. The rear of the trailer hit something solid, and there was a grinding crash that traveled through the entire rig. Leland had backed into the guardrail, or maybe a boulder, he couldn't tell which, but either way he was stuck now. He tried to shift into first gear to pull forward, but the engine was making a sound it definitely shouldn't be making, a knocking rattle that suggested catastrophic damage. And when he pressed the accelerator, nothing happened. The engine was dead or dying, and they were sitting ducks. Leland looked over at Ephraim and saw blood on the old man's face, saw him clutching his arm where one of the bullets must have caught him, and felt a surge of rage that pushed through his fear. This wasn't right. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They were innocent people just trying to get down the mountain, and this corrupt sheriff with his family secrets was going to kill them both and throw their bodies down the same slope where his grandfather lay, and nobody would ever know what really happened here. "We have to run," Leland said, grabbing Ephraim's good arm. "Out to the passenger side, into the woods. It's our only chance." Ephraim shook his head, his eyes glazed with shock and pain. "Can't run," he mumbled. "Too old, too hurt. You go, save yourself. Someone needs to survive to tell the story." "I'm not leaving you," Leland said firmly. He looked around the cab desperately for anything that might help them, any weapon or tool they could use to defend themselves, and his eyes landed on the fire extinguisher mounted behind the driver's seat. It wasn't much, but it was heavy and solid, and better than nothing. He grabbed it, and then kicked open the passenger door, half dragging Ephraim toward the opening. The old man was heavier than he looked, dead weight made worse by his injury and his shock, but Leland managed to get him to the edge of the seat just as another bullet punched through the back of the cab, where Leland's head had been moments before. They tumbled out of the truck together, landing hard on the frozen ground, and Leland felt something in his knee pop painfully. He ignored it and hauled Ephraim to his feet, pulling the old man toward the tree line that started maybe 20 feet from the road. Behind them, he could hear Conrad's boots crunching on the gravel, could hear the man's breathing steady and controlled, like he was out for an evening stroll rather than hunting two people through the dark. Leland risked a glance back and saw Conrad's silhouette moving past the truck's headlights, saw the gun held low and ready, saw the expression of grim determination on the sheriff's face. This was a man who'd made up his mind and wouldn't be deterred by conscience or second thoughts. A man who'd already crossed too many lines to turn back now. They reached the trees, and Leland pulled Ephraim behind the thick trunk of a pine, pressing them both flat against the bark. His heart was hammering so hard he thought Conrad might be able to hear it, and his breath was coming in short gasps that created clouds of mist in the cold air. Ephraim was making soft, whimpering sounds, his injured arm cradled against his chest, blood dripping down his fingers and spattering on the snow at their feet. They needed to keep moving, needed to put more distance between themselves and Conrad, but Leland didn't know these woods, and in the dark they could easily walk right off a cliff or into a ravine. The moonlight that filtered through the clouds was barely enough to see by, casting everything in shades of silver and black, turning familiar shapes into threatening shadows. "I know you're out there," Conrad's voice called from somewhere near the truck. He sounded calm, almost friendly, like he was addressing old friends rather than people he intended to murder. "I know you think you can hide in those woods until morning, and then make your way down to town. But it's not going to work. You're leaving a blood trail that a blind man could follow, and I've hunted these mountains since I was a boy. I know every game trail, every hiding spot, every way down to the valley. There's nowhere you can go that I can't find you." He was probably right about that, Leland thought. The blood dripping from Ephraim's arm was leaving a clear trail in the snow, marking their passage as clearly as if they'd painted arrows. And even if they could somehow stop the bleeding, they were making noise as they moved through the underbrush, snapping branches and dislodging rocks, announcing their position to anyone who was listening. Conrad could take his time tracking them, could follow at a leisurely pace knowing they'd eventually tire or make a mistake or simply collapse from exhaustion and injury. And then he'd finish what he'd started, put bullets in both their heads, and drag their bodies somewhere they'd never be found. Unless Leland could turn the tables somehow, could find a way to become the hunter instead of the hunted. He looked down at the fire extinguisher in his hands, feeling its weight, and an idea began to form. It was desperate and probably stupid and had maybe a 10% chance of working, but 10% was better than 0. He leaned close to Ephraim and whispered directly into the old man's ear, keeping his voice so low that Conrad wouldn't hear it even if he was standing right next to them. "I'm going to lead him away from you," Leland breathed. "Going to make noise, make him think we're both running deeper into the woods. Once he's far enough from the road, you circle back to his truck. Keys are probably still in the ignition if he was in such a hurry. Drive down to town, get help, tell them everything. Can you do that?" Ephraim's eyes focused on Leland's face, and for a moment the old man looked clear and lucid. Looked like he understood exactly what Leland was proposing and what it would mean. "He'll kill you," Ephraim whispered back. "He'll catch you and kill you, and it'll be my fault. Another death on my conscience." "Maybe," Leland admitted. "But if I don't do something, we're both dead anyway. At least this way, one of us has a chance to survive. One of us can make sure the truth comes out. Those boys who died in the mine, they deserve justice. Your silence all these years. You can make up for it now by getting out of here and telling your story. Don't waste this chance, Ephraim. Don't let it all be for nothing." The old man nodded slowly, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I won't forget this," he said. "Won't forget what you done for me. If I get out of here, I'll make sure everyone knows your name, knows what you sacrificed." "Just get out of here," Leland said. "That's all I need." He didn't wait for further response. He pushed away from the tree and started moving deeper into the woods, making no effort to be quiet, deliberately stepping on branches that would snap under his weight and kicking through drifts of snow. Behind him, he heard Conrad react immediately, heard the man start moving in his direction, and Leland forced himself to keep going even though every instinct screamed at him to find cover and hide. He needed to draw Conrad away from the road, needed to give Ephraim time to make it back to the truck, and that meant making himself an obvious target. The woods here were dense and primordial, the kind of old-growth forest that had never seen a saw or an axe, and the trees grew so close together that Leland had to turn sideways to squeeze between them in places. The ground was uneven and treacherous, covered in exposed roots and hidden rocks, and twice he nearly fell as his feet slipped on patches of ice. His injured knee was screaming at him with every step, a hot spike of pain that made him want to stop and rest, but he couldn't stop. Conrad was behind him and getting closer, moving through the woods with the confidence of someone who knew this terrain intimately, and Leland could hear branches breaking and footsteps crunching in the snow, maybe 30 or 40 yards back. Leland came to a small clearing where the moonlight was stronger, illuminating a space maybe 20 feet across that was relatively flat and open. On the far side of the clearing, the ground dropped away sharply, and Leland could hear the sound of running water somewhere below, a stream or creek cutting through the rocks. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned around, pressing his back against a tree, the fire extinguisher held ready. This was as good a place as any to make his stand, to try his desperate gambit. He could see the shape of Conrad approaching through the trees, could see the gun raised and ready, and he knew he'd only get one chance at this. If he missed, if his timing was off by even a second, he'd be dead before he hit the ground. Conrad stepped into the clearing and stopped, scanning the shadows with his gun moving in smooth arcs. He looked relaxed, confident, completely in control of the situation. And why wouldn't he be? He had the gun, he had the advantage of knowing these woods, and he had 2 unarmed men running from him in a blind panic. As far as Conrad was concerned, this was already over. It was just a matter of time before he found them and finished the job. "I gotta admit, you've got more fight in you than I expected," Conrad called out, his voice echoing slightly in the clearing. "Most people would have given up by now, would have just laid down and accepted the inevitable. But you keep running, keep trying to find a way out. I respect that. It's pointless, but I respect it. Tell you what, you come out now, tell me where the old man is, and I'll make it quick. 1 shot, clean, you won't feel a thing. That's better than freezing to death out here or bleeding out from a gut shot, right?" Leland didn't respond, didn't move. He was waiting, calculating, trying to time this perfectly. Conrad took another step into the clearing, then another, sweeping the tree line with his gun. He was maybe 15 feet away now. close enough that Leland could see the expression on his face, calm, focused, professional. This was a man who'd done this before, Leland realized. This wasn't his first time hunting someone through the woods with the intent to kill. How many others had there been? How many people had stumbled onto the wrong secret or asked the wrong question and ended up dead on Conrad Hollis's watch? "You know what the funny thing is?" Conrad continued, still scanning the shadows. "My grandfather really was having second thoughts. Started talking about confessing, about clearing his conscience before he died. Said he couldn't meet his maker with all those deaths on his soul. Can you believe that? 70 years he kept that secret. 70 years of living free while those boys rotted in the ground, and suddenly he decides he needs to come clean. Well, I couldn't let that happen. Family's reputation, my career as sheriff, it would all be destroyed if the truth came out. So I did what needed to be done. Told him I wanted to meet him up here to talk about it. Then put a bullet in the back of his head and threw him down the slope. Made it look like an accident. And nobody will ever know different because the only witnesses are going to be dead within the hour." The confession was damning, more than enough to convict Conrad of murder if anyone ever heard it, but Leland knew that was exactly why Conrad was being so open about it. Dead men couldn't testify. Dead men couldn't repeat what they'd heard. Conrad was planning to kill them both, and any secrets he revealed would die with them. It was actually smart in a sick, twisted way, unburdening himself, knowing there would be no consequences. Conrad took another step forward, and finally spotted Leland standing in the shadows at the edge of the clearing. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a frozen moment, neither man moved. Then Conrad started to raise his gun, and Leland exploded into motion, pulling the pin on the fire extinguisher and squeezing the trigger. A jet of white chemical foam shot out with surprising force, catching Conrad directly in the face and chest. The sheriff stumbled backward, his gun hand coming up to protect his eyes, and Leland charged across the clearing, swinging the heavy metal cylinder like a club. The extinguisher connected with Conrad's wrist, and there was a crack of breaking bone. The gun went spinning away into the snow, and Conrad screamed, a sound of pain and rage, but he didn't go down. He lunged forward despite his injury, his good hand reaching for Leland's throat, and suddenly they were grappling in the middle of the clearing with the moonlight cold and silver on their struggling forms. Conrad was younger and stronger than Leland had expected, and despite his broken wrist he fought with the desperation of someone who knew this was life or death. They crashed to the ground together, rolling through the snow and the foam still dripping from the extinguisher, each trying to gain the upper hand. Conrad got his good hand around Leland's throat and squeezed, his face twisted with fury and hatred. Leland's vision started to darken at the edges, and he knew he had seconds before he passed out. Seconds before Conrad choked the life out of him. He still had the fire extinguisher clutched in one hand, and he brought it up blindly, smashing it into the side of Conrad's head. Once, twice, 3 times, until he felt Conrad's grip loosen and saw the sheriff's eyes roll back. Leland hit him again for good measure and then pushed the limp body off and rolled away, gasping for air, his throat feeling like it had been crushed. He lay there in the snow for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, trying to get his breathing under control, trying to process what had just happened. He'd nearly died. Would have died if Conrad had been a little faster or a little stronger. And Conrad might still wake up, might still come after him if Leland didn't finish this now while he had the chance. He could pick up a rock and bash Conrad's skull in, could make sure the sheriff never hurt anyone ever again. It would be self-defense, justified, completely legal, but as Leland looked down at Conrad's unconscious form, at the blood running from the gash on his temple where the fire extinguisher had connected, he found he couldn't do it. Couldn't kill a helpless man in cold blood, no matter how much that man might deserve it. Instead, he searched Conrad's pockets and found a phone, No signal this far up the mountain, but maybe it would work further down, and a set of keys that were probably for the pickup truck. He also found a wallet with Conrad's sheriff's badge and ID, confirming at least that part of his story had been true. Leland pocketed everything, and then used Conrad's own belt to tie the sheriff's hands behind his back, cinching it tight enough that there was no way he could slip free even when he woke up. Then Leland grabbed the gun from where it had fallen in the snow, checked that it was loaded, and started making his way back toward the road. His knee was agony now, barely supporting his weight, and he had to use trees for support as he limped through the woods. But he was alive, and Conrad was neutralized, and with any luck Ephraim had made it back to the truck and was already halfway to town getting help. When Leland finally emerged from the tree line, he saw that Conrad's pickup was gone. The road was empty except for his own disabled truck with its shattered windshield and bullet holes, and there were fresh tire tracks in the snow leading down the mountain. Ephraim had done it. The old man had made it back to the vehicle and escaped, and that meant everything Leland had risked had been worth it. He felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly buckled his knees, and he had to lean against his truck for support. They'd survived, against all odds. Despite Conrad's planning and his advantages and his willingness to kill, they'd actually survived. Leland climbed painfully into his cab and sat in the driver's seat, Conrad's gun resting in his lap, and waited. The engine was definitely dead, killed by one of Conrad's bullets, and the cab was freezing now that the windshield was gone and the wind was pouring in. But Leland didn't care about the cold. He was alive, and Ephraim was alive, and eventually help would arrive. He just needed to sit here and wait and make sure Conrad didn't somehow get free and come back to finish what he'd started. The sky in the east was starting to lighten, suggesting dawn wasn't far off, and with daylight would come traffic and other drivers who could offer assistance. Time passed in a strange blur, minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Leland's body was starting to shut down now that the adrenaline was wearing off, and he could feel every injury demanding attention. His throat where Conrad had choked him, his shoulder where the bullet had grazed him, his knee that had twisted when he fell from the truck. He was going to need medical attention, was probably going to need surgery on the knee, but he'd worry about that later. For now, he just sat and watched the road and kept Conrad's gun ready in case the sheriff somehow managed to free himself and make it back to the highway. The sun was fully up when Leland finally heard vehicles approaching from downhill. He straightened in his seat, wincing at the pain the movement caused, and watched as 3 sheriff's department cruisers came around the curve with their lights flashing. They pulled up near his truck and officers piled out, their hands on their weapons, their expressions wary and alert. Leland raised his hand slowly to show he wasn't a threat, and called out to them, his voice hoarse and damaged from being choked. "Conrad Hollis is about 200 yards into the woods on a bearing of roughly northwest," he said. "He's unconscious and restrained, but still armed. There's also a body at the bottom of the slope by his truck, elderly male, possible homicide. And you need to send someone to check on Ephraim Dunbar, who should have made it to town by now in Conrad's pickup. He's injured and needs medical attention." The officers looked at each other, clearly confused by this information dump, and then the one who seemed to be in charge, a woman in her 40s with iron-gray hair and captain's bars on her collar, stepped forward. "I'm Captain Sarah Vickers," she said. "We got a call about 20 minutes ago from an elderly man claiming Sheriff Hollis had murdered his grandfather and tried to kill him and a truck driver up on Loveland Pass. We weren't sure whether to believe him. Conrad's been sheriff in Silver Creek for 15 years. Well respected, no complaints or issues. But the old man was so insistent and so detailed in his story that we figured we'd better check it out. You must be the truck driver he mentioned, Leland Briscoe." Leland nodded. "That's me, and everything Ephraim told you is true." Conrad killed his grandfather to keep him from confessing to murders that happened 70 years ago, then tried to kill both of us to cover it up. He shot up my truck, chased us into the woods, and I had to fight him in self-defense. You'll find all the evidence you need. Bullet holes in my truck, blood trail leading into the woods, Conrad's own confession if you get him to talk. But the real story, the one that started all this, is in an old mine shaft somewhere near an abandoned mining camp. Ephraim can tell you where to look. He witnessed murders back in the 50s, kept quiet about them all these years, and Conrad's family were the ones responsible. Captain Vickers studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then she nodded to her officers. Stevens Miller, take Briscoe here down to the hospital and get him checked out. Make sure he gives a complete statement before he's released. Patterson, you're with me. We're going to find Conrad Hollis and have a very interesting conversation with him. The next few hours passed in another blur of activity. Leland was transported to the hospital in Idaho Springs where doctors examined his injuries. The graze wound on his shoulder was superficial and would heal on its own, but his throat showed bruising consistent with strangulation and would need to be monitored for swelling, and his knee was badly damaged and would require surgery to repair torn ligaments. They admitted him overnight for observation and pain management, and while he was lying in his hospital bed, a detective came to take his statement. Leland told him everything. Every detail from the moment he picked up Ephraim to the fight in the clearing, and the detective recorded it all with a small digital recorder. The detective who took Leland's statement was a younger man named Marcus Petrie, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of eager energy that suggested he hadn't been doing this job long enough to become cynical about it yet. He asked good questions, though, thorough questions, circling back to points that didn't quite line up or needed clarification. And Leland got the sense that Petrie was genuinely trying to understand what had happened rather than just checking boxes on a form. When they finished, Petrie thanked Leland for his cooperation and said he'd be in touch if they needed anything else, then left Leland alone with his thoughts and his pain medication that was making everything feel distant and unreal. Leland dozed fitfully through the afternoon, waking periodically to the sound of nurses checking his vitals or doctors examining his injuries. Each time he woke, he had a moment of disorientation where he couldn't remember where he was or why he hurt so badly, and then it would all come rushing back. The pickup blocking the road, Conrad with his gun, the desperate fight in the clearing. He wondered if Ephraim was somewhere else in this same hospital, wondered if the old man's injuries were being treated, and whether he was holding up okay after everything they'd been through. Leland had saved Ephraim's life, and Ephraim had saved his in return, and that created a bond between them that Leland suspected would last for whatever time either of them had left in this world. The sun was setting outside his window, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that were almost too beautiful given the ugliness of the day, when Captain Vickers came to visit him. She knocked softly on the doorframe and waited for Leland to acknowledge her before entering, which he appreciated. Too many people in positions of authority just barged in assuming their badge gave them the right to intrude, but Vickers seemed to have more respect for boundaries than that. She pulled a chair up beside his bed and sat down with a heavy sigh, like she'd been on her feet for far too long, and was grateful for even a few minutes of rest. "How are you feeling?" she asked, and something in her tone suggested she genuinely wanted to know, rather than just asking out of politeness. "Like I got run over by my own truck," Leland said, his voice still rough and painful. "But alive, which is more than I had any right to expect a few hours ago. How's Ephraim? They won't tell me anything because of privacy laws or whatever." Vickers nodded. "He's stable. The bullet went through his arm without hitting anything major, and he's mostly just suffering from exhaustion and exposure. Doctors say he'll make a full recovery physically, though the psychological impact of what he went through might take longer to heal. He's been talking to us, though, telling us everything he remembers about the murders in the mine. We've got a forensic team heading up to the old mining camp tomorrow morning to start excavating the shaft he identified. If there are bodies down there like he claims, we'll find them." "And Conrad?" Leland asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Vickers' expression hardened. "We found him right where you said he'd be, still unconscious and restrained. He's got a concussion and a broken wrist from your fire extinguisher, and he's going to need dental work from where you hit him in the face. But he'll survive to stand trial, which is what matters. We've already charged him with the murder of his grandfather, whose body we recovered from the slope. A single gunshot to the back of the head, just like Ephraim said. We're also charging him with 2 counts of attempted murder for what he did to you and Ephraim, plus weapons charges and a whole list of other crimes. His lawyer is already trying to spin it as a mental breakdown, claiming the stress of the job got to him, but nobody's buying it. The evidence is too clear." She paused and looked down at her hands, and Leland could see she was struggling with something. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more personal. "Conrad Hollis was my colleague for 15 years, she said. "I worked with him, trusted him, considered him a friend. And all that time he was hiding this darkness, this willingness to kill anyone who threatened his family's secrets. It makes me question everything I thought I knew about reading people, about spotting the warning signs. How do you miss something like that in someone you see almost every day?" Leland understood the question because he'd been asking himself similar things. How had he missed the danger in Conrad when the man first approached him on the road? What signs had he overlooked or dismissed? "I don't think you can always tell," he said finally. "Some people are just good at hiding what they really are. They put on a mask and wear it so long it becomes their real face, and the monster underneath only shows itself when circumstances force it to. That's not your fault. That's just human nature. We want to believe the best about people, especially people we know and work with. Conrad exploited that trust, used it as camouflage. But eventually, the mask always slips, and when it did, you responded exactly right. You believed Ephraim when he came to you with his story, even though it meant suspecting one of your own. That takes courage." Vickers gave him a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ephraim says you're a hero, says you saved his life by drawing Conrad away and giving him time to escape. He's already talking to reporters, telling anyone who'll listen about the brave truck driver who risked everything to protect a stranger. You're going to be famous, at least for a little while." The thought made Leland uncomfortable. He hadn't done what he did for recognition or praise, had just been trying to survive and help someone who needed help. The idea of news cameras and interviews and people treating him like some kind of celebrity was deeply unappealing. "I just did what anyone would have done," he said. "No," Vickers said firmly. "Most people would have driven past Ephraim without stopping, or would have thrown him out of the truck at the first sign of trouble. You stopped, you listened, you believed him when you had every reason not to, and you fought for him when things turned dangerous. That's not what everyone would do. That's what a good person does, and we need more of those in the world." She stood up and handed Leland a business card with her name and contact information. "You'll need to come back to testify at Conrad's trial, probably in a few months once the prosecution builds their case. In the meantime, if you remember anything else or if you need anything at all, call me. And Leland, thank you. What you did up on that pass, what you helped us uncover, it's going to bring closure to families who've been wondering for decades what happened to their sons and brothers. That matters. Don't forget that when the nightmares start, because they will start. What you went through, what you saw, that leaves marks. But you survived it, and you helped stop a killer. Hold on to that when things get dark." After she left, Leland lay in his hospital bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about what she'd said about nightmares. He'd already had them during his brief periods of sleep that afternoon, dreams where Conrad's gun was pointed at his face, dreams where he couldn't breathe because hands were crushing his throat, dreams where he was falling down an endless mine shaft past the skeletal remains of men who'd been dead for 70 years. Vickers was right that the psychological impact would linger long after his physical injuries healed, but she was also right that he'd survived and helped stop something evil from continuing. That had to count for something. The hospital released him the next morning with prescriptions for pain medication and antibiotics, instructions for caring for his injuries, and a referral to an orthopedic surgeon who could perform the knee surgery he'd need in a few weeks. A nurse wheeled him out to the pickup area where a taxi was waiting to take him to a motel, since his truck was still up on the pass being processed as evidence and probably wasn't drivable anyway, given the bullet damage. The trucking company had already been notified about what happened and had arranged for another driver to complete his delivery, and they'd assured Leland his job would be waiting for him once he was cleared to return to work. That was something, at least. One less thing to worry about in a situation that had generated more than enough worry to last a lifetime. The motel was cheap and clean, the kind of place that catered to truck drivers and construction workers who needed somewhere to sleep that wouldn't break the bank. Leland checked in and limped to his room, every step sending jolts of pain through his damaged knee, and collapsed on the bed without even bothering to undress. He was asleep within minutes, exhausted in a way that went deeper than just physical tiredness. This was the exhaustion of someone who'd pushed their body and mind to absolute limits and barely survived the experience, and his system needed time to recover and process everything that had happened. He woke to darkness and the sound of his phone ringing. For a confused moment, he thought he was back in his truck, thought he'd dreamed everything and was about to start another normal night of driving, but then the pain in his knee and shoulder reminded him that it had all been real. He fumbled for his phone on the nightstand and saw an unknown number on the screen. He almost didn't answer. It was probably a reporter who'd somehow gotten his number and wanted a statement, but something made him swipe to accept the call. "Mr. Briscoe?" The voice on the other end was raspy and familiar. "Ephraim, I hope I'm not bothering you. The hospital gave me your number, said you'd probably want to hear from me. I wanted to call and thank you proper-like, not just through police or reporters, but direct from me to you." "You don't need to thank me," Leland said, his own voice still rough. "We helped each other up there. I wouldn't have made it without you taking that truck and getting help." "Maybe," Ephraim conceded, "but you're the one who stopped to pick me up in the first place when any sensible person would have kept driving. You're the one who believed my story when everyone else thought I was crazy. And you're the one who fought Conrad and gave me time to escape. I won't ever forget that, Leland. Whatever years I got left, I owe them to you." They talked for a while longer, two men who'd been through something terrible together and were trying to make sense of it. Ephraim told him that the forensic team had already started excavating the mine shaft and had found remains, lots of them, confirming everything he'd said about the murders. The investigation was going to take months, maybe years, as they identified all the victims and tried to piece together exactly what had happened in that mine so many decades ago. But at least now the truth was coming out, and the families would finally know what happened to their loved ones. "I've been living with guilt for 70 years, Ephraim said quietly. "Every day knowing I could have stopped it, could have gone to the police when the first boy disappeared. But I was too scared. I told myself I was protecting my own life, that survival was more important than justice, but that was just cowardice dressed up in fancy words. I let those boys die because I was afraid, and I got to live with that. But maybe now, maybe helping catch Conrad and getting the truth out there, maybe that balances the scales a little bit. Maybe I can die knowing I finally did the right thing, even if it took me most of a lifetime to work up the courage." "You did the right thing," Leland assured him. "And you can't change the past, can't go back and make different choices. All any of us can do is try to do better going forward. Try to be brave when it matters. You were brave up on that pass, Ephraim. You climbed into a stranger's truck not knowing if I could be trusted. You told your story knowing Conrad might find you, and you got behind the wheel of his truck and drove to get help even though you were hurt and scared. That's courage. Don't discount it." After they hung up, Leland lay in the dark and thought about courage and cowardice, about the choices people made and the consequences that rippled out from those choices for decades. Ephraim had made a choice to stay silent 70 years ago, and that choice had allowed more murders to happen, had allowed a killer to go free and eventually pass his secrets and his sins down to his grandson. But Ephraim had also made a choice on that mountain pass to finally tell the truth, to risk everything to bring justice to men who'd been dead longer than Leland had been alive. Which choice defined him? Which one mattered more? Leland didn't know. Wasn't sure anyone could make that kind of moral calculation. All he knew was that when it mattered, when lives were on the line, Ephraim had chosen right. That had to count for something. Over the next few days, Leland stayed in the motel and followed the news coverage of the case. It was everywhere, local news, national news, even some international outlets had picked up the story of the sheriff who'd murdered his own grandfather to hide decades-old crimes. The mining camp became a crime scene circus with forensic teams and reporters and curiosity seekers all trying to get close enough to see what was happening. The body count from the mine shaft kept rising as they dug deeper and found more remains, 23 so far, with more expected as the excavation continued. Each set of remains represented someone's son or brother or father who'd disappeared and never been found, and the families started coming forward with their stories of loss and wondering and grief that had never quite healed. Ephraim became a reluctant celebrity, his lined face appearing on every news broadcast as he told his story over and over again. Some people called him a hero for finally coming forward, while others called him a coward for waiting so long. Leland didn't think either label was quite right. Ephraim was just a man who'd made a terrible mistake when he was young and had spent the rest of his life trying to live with it, and now he was trying to make amends the only way he knew how. That was more complicated than hero or coward, more human, and Leland found he had more respect for Ephraim's honesty about his failures than he would have had for someone who tried to pretend they'd always been brave. His own role in the story got plenty of attention too, though Leland did his best to avoid the reporters who called his room or waited in the motel parking lot hoping to catch him. He gave one brief statement to a local news channel, explaining in simple terms what had happened and why he'd stopped to help Ephraim, and then he refused all other interview requests. He wasn't interested in fame or attention, didn't want to be treated like some kind of action hero when he'd mostly just been trying not to die. Let Ephraim have the spotlight if he wanted it. Leland was content to fade back into anonymity and get on with his life. The trucking company contacted him after about a week to let him know his rig had been towed to a repair facility, and the insurance company had deemed it a total loss due to the extent of the damage. They'd be assigning him a new truck once he was cleared to return to work, but for now he should focus on healing and getting ready for his knee surgery. The company also let him know that several news outlets had offered substantial sums of money for exclusive interviews with him, and while the final decision was his, they'd appreciate it if he considered how any publicity might reflect on them as his employer. Leland assured them he had no intention of doing any interviews, paid or otherwise, and they seemed relieved. His surgery was scheduled for 2 weeks after the incident on the pass, and the time passed in a strange suspended state where Leland felt disconnected from normal life. He couldn't drive, couldn't work, couldn't do much of anything except sit in his motel room and watch television and think about everything that had happened. His wife called him daily from their home in Kansas, worried and upset that he'd been through something so traumatic and she hadn't been there. Leland did his best to reassure her that he was fine, that his injuries were healing and he'd be home soon, but he could hear the doubt in her voice. She knew him too well, knew when he was putting on a brave face to keep her from worrying, and eventually she stopped asking how he was and started just talking about ordinary things, what was happening in their neighborhood, what their daughter was up to, what she was planning to make for dinner. The normalcy of it all was soothing in a way Leland hadn't expected, a reminder that the world continued turning regardless of what happened to any individual person. The day before his surgery, Ephraim came to visit him at the motel. The old man looked better than he had on the pass, cleaner, healthier, like regular food and shelter and medical care had done wonders for him. His arm was in a sling and he moved stiffly, but his eyes were clearer than they'd been, and he seemed more grounded in reality. He brought coffee and sandwiches from a deli down the street, and they sat in Leland's room eating and talking about nothing in particular. It was comfortable in a way that surprised Leland, this easy companionship with a man he barely knew, but with whom he'd shared an experience that bonded them more deeply than years of casual friendship could have done. They offered me a place in a facility for old folks, Ephraim said at one point. Nice place, assisted living they call it, where they help you with stuff you can't do yourself anymore. Got 3 meals a day, activities, people to talk to. A social worker says it would be good for me. Says living alone in that mining camp all those years wasn't healthy. But I don't know. I'm not sure I'm ready to be around people all the time. Not sure I know how to be normal anymore. Nobody's normal, Leland said. We're all just pretending and hoping nobody notices. You should take the offer if you want it, if you think it might make your life better. But don't do it because someone tells you that's what you should do. You've spent enough of your life doing what other people expected. Do what feels right to you. Ephraim nodded slowly, considering that. What about you? He asked. You going back to truck driving after your knee heals? That's the plan, Leland said. It's what I know, what I'm good at. Can't imagine doing anything else at this point in my life. Though I'll probably stick to routes that don't go through mountain passes for a while, at least until the memories aren't so fresh. They both smiled at that, a shared understanding that some places carried weight now, carried associations that would take time to fade. Leland doubted he'd ever be able to drive Loveland Pass again without thinking about that night, without seeing Conrad's silhouette against his headlights or feeling the gun pointed at his face. Some experiences marked you permanently, changed the way you saw the world, and there was no going back to who you'd been before. Ephraim left after an hour or so, promising to keep in touch, and to let Leland know if he decided to take the assisted living placement. They shook hands at the door, carefully because of Ephraim's injured arm and Leland's various wounds, and Leland watched the old man walk to a cab waiting in the parking lot. He looked small and frail in the afternoon light, a survivor of traumas both recent and ancient, and Leland found himself hoping that Ephraim's remaining years would be peaceful ones. He deserved that much at least, deserved some measure of comfort after spending 7 decades haunted by guilt and fear. The surgery went well, or at least that's what the doctors told Leland when he woke up in the recovery room with his leg immobilized and pain medication making everything feel fuzzy and distant. They'd repaired the torn ligaments and said he should make a full recovery with proper physical therapy, though it would be months before he could return to driving. That was fine with Leland. He had disability insurance through the trucking company and savings to fall back on, and his wife had already said she was happy to have him home for an extended period, even if it meant taking care of his grumpy, injured self. He'd spend the recovery time catching up on projects around the house, spending time with his daughter and grandkids, trying to be a normal person with a normal life for a while. But even as he made these plans, even as he focused on the practical details of recovery and return to normalcy, Leland knew that something fundamental had changed in him. He'd always been someone who helped people when he could, who stopped for stranded motorists and gave rides to hitchhikers and generally tried to be a decent human being. But there was a difference between casual kindness and what he'd done on Loveland Pass. He'd risked his life for a stranger, had fought a killer, had made choices that could easily have ended with him dead in the snow. And having done that once, having discovered that capacity for courage or recklessness or whatever you wanted to call it, he couldn't pretend it didn't exist. It would change how he saw the world, how he responded to situations, how he understood his own capabilities and limits. The trial happened 8 months later, in a courthouse in Denver that had been chosen because of concerns about finding an unbiased jury anywhere closer to where the crimes had occurred. Leland testified for an entire day, walking the jury through everything that had happened from the moment he picked up Ephraim to the fight in the clearing. The defense attorney tried to paint him as an unreliable witness who'd misunderstood Conrad's intentions and overreacted with excessive force, but the physical evidence was too strong to overcome. The bullet holes in Leland's truck, the trajectory analysis that proved Conrad had been firing to kill rather than disable, the location of the grandfather's body with a bullet in the back of his head, it all added up to a clear picture of premeditated murder and attempted murder. Ephraim testified too, spending 2 days on the stand describing what he'd witnessed in the mine 70 years ago and identifying the remains that had been recovered from the shaft. DNA analysis had confirmed the identities of 19 of the victims so far, with more identifications expected as they continued comparing dental records and DNA profiles. Each confirmed identity brought closure to another family, another set of relatives who could finally lay their loved ones to rest properly, and Leland could see the weight of those lives pressing down on Ephraim as he spoke. The old man had held these secrets for so long, had carried the burden of knowledge alone, and now that he was finally releasing it, the relief was visible on his face, even as he struggled with the renewed guilt of telling the story. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Conrad Hollis was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, effectively ensuring he would die in prison. He showed no emotion when the verdicts were read, no remorse or regret, just the same cold, dead-eyed stare he'd had on the pass when he'd been hunting them through the dark. Some people were broken in ways that couldn't be fixed, Leland thought as he watched Conrad being led away in shackles. Some people made choices that took them so far down a dark path that there was no finding their way back to the light. All you could do was make sure they couldn't hurt anyone else, lock them away where their particular brand of evil couldn't spread. After the trial, Leland returned to driving. His knee had healed as well as the doctors predicted, with only occasional stiffness and pain to remind him of what had happened. He took routes all over the country, hauling everything from furniture to electronics to construction materials, falling back into the rhythm of life on the road that had defined him for 3 decades. But he drove differently now, more cautiously, paying closer attention to his surroundings and the people he encountered. He still stopped to help stranded motorists, still gave rides to people who needed them, but he was more selective about it, more aware of the potential dangers. He'd learned that kindness and caution weren't mutually exclusive, that you could be a good person while still protecting yourself. He and Ephraim stayed in touch, trading emails and occasional phone calls, comparing notes on how they were handling the aftermath of their shared trauma. Ephraim had taken the placement in the assisted living facility and reported that it was better than he'd expected, that having regular meals and social interaction and people to talk to was helping him feel more human again. He'd even started writing his memoirs, trying to put down on paper everything he remembered about the mining days and the murders and the long years of silence that followed. He wanted it on record, wanted future generations to know what had happened and learn from it. Wanted to make sure those boys who'd died in the mine would never be completely forgotten. Leland's own nightmares faded gradually over time, becoming less frequent and less intense as the months turned into years. He still had them occasionally, dreams where he was trapped in his truck while Conrad shot at him, dreams where he was fighting in the clearing and losing, dreams where Ephraim didn't make it to town, and Conrad found them both helpless and injured. But they no longer woke him in a cold sweat, no longer made him afraid to close his eyes. They were just dreams, memories his brain was processing and filing away, and eventually they'd fade into the background noise of his subconscious, along with all the other difficult experiences he'd accumulated over a lifetime. 3 years after the incident on Loveland Pass, Leland got a call from a hospice nurse telling him that Ephraim had died peacefully in his sleep. The old man had been 92 years old and had spent his final years in relative comfort, surrounded by people who cared about him and finally free of the guilt that had haunted him for so long. He'd left instructions for Leland to be notified when he passed and had also left him something in his will, a small wooden box containing a collection of photographs from the mining camp, pictures of the men who'd worked there before the murders started. Young faces, hopeful faces, men who'd come to Colorado looking for a fresh start and found only death. Ephraim had kept these photographs for 70 years, unable to throw them away but also unable to look at them without being reminded of his failures. Now he wanted Leland to have them, to be their guardian, to make sure they were never forgotten. Leland kept the box in his truck, stowed in a compartment behind the driver's seat where he'd see it every time he climbed into the cab. It was a reminder of what he'd been through, of the people he'd helped save and the evil he'd helped to stop. It was a reminder that sometimes ordinary people were called to do extraordinary things, and that the choices you made in those moments defined who you were more surely than years of routine and normalcy ever could. He'd been tested on Loveland Pass, and he'd passed that test, had discovered reserves of courage and determination he hadn't known he possessed. That was worth remembering, worth honoring, worth carrying with him as he continued down all the dark highways still to come. Sometimes, late at night when he was driving through the mountains, when the road ahead was empty and the rest of the world was asleep, Leland would think about Conrad Hollis, sitting in a prison cell somewhere paying for his crimes. He'd think about Ephraim, spending his final years in peace after so long in torment. He'd think about the families who'd finally gotten answers about their missing loved ones, who'd been able to bury their dead and move forward with their grief. And he'd think about all the other secrets buried in these mountains, all the other stories that would never be told because the witnesses had stayed silent, or the evidence had been hidden too well, or the killers had been just a little bit smarter or luckier. The world was full of darkness, full of people who did terrible things and got away with them, full of injustices that would never be corrected and wrongs that would never be righted. But it was also full of people like Ephraim who eventually found the courage to speak truth, and people like Leland who stopped to help strangers even when it would have been easier and safer not to. Those people didn't make headlines or get remembered in history books, didn't change the world in any dramatic visible way, but they mattered. They held the line against the darkness, one small act of courage or kindness at a time, and sometimes that was enough to make a difference in someone's life or bring justice to someone's death. Leland still drove Loveland Pass occasionally, though never at night and never alone if he could help it. The road looked different now, less menacing, just another stretch of highway winding through beautiful mountain scenery. But he knew what had happened there, knew what he'd survived, and sometimes when he drove past the spot where Conrad's truck had been blocking the road, he'd slow down and spare a thought for that November night 3 years ago. The night that had tested him and changed him and shown him things about himself he'd never had to know. The night he'd looked evil in the face and refused to blink. And then he'd accelerate back to speed and continue down the mountain toward whatever came next. The photographs of dead miners in their box behind his seat, the memories of that night filed away, but never quite forgotten. The knowledge that he'd done the right thing warming him more surely than any heater ever could. That was what he'd carry forward into whatever remained of his life and his career. The certainty that when the moment came, when he'd been called to choose between self-preservation and doing what was right, he'd chosen right. Not perfectly, not without fear or doubt, but right nonetheless. That had to be enough. That was all anyone could really ask of themselves.